I figured.
This next panel is entitled Songs from Beyond the Anthropocene, Language and Language for the Future. It's a title that Elena... Yeah, we'll talk more. Yeah, we were talking when we came up with this. So I'm going to go through the order of speakers. So Elena Nedmodidou is speaking first, and she's with the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies. Her research focuses on the intersection between romantic aesthetic theory and romantic conceptualizations of the other, be it the other gender or the cultural other, such as the Orient. She's published several articles and in German, and I'm not going to read the titles. I was going to, but decided not to.
Pronounce it in French.
Yeah, right. French, yeah. So she's written about German romantic aesthetics, German Orientalism, and romantic conceptions of gender and cosmopolitanism. She's published, for instance, Veiled Narratives Novalis' Heinrich von Ofterdingen as a staging of Orientalist discourse in German Quarterly. She's also written about Brecht, Kafka, and Body, an article which appeared in Brecht Yearbook, and has a forthcoming article on estrangement, ethics, and Brecht's Ja-Sager, Nein-Sager. She's currently working on two projects, Between Homage and Transgression, the Cosmopolitan Cultural Practice in Utility von Goethe's journal Chaos, an article forthcoming in a special issue of Seminar on the topic of Goethe World's Literatures, as well as a comparative study on the motif of snow in the poetry of Bertolt Brecht and Paul Celan. Our second speaker is Nina Belmonte from the Department of Philosophy. She has a PhD from Stony Brook, and her dissertation was on critical theory and Derrida, and is currently working through many of the same questions there, but at the intersection of philosophy and literature. Nina has published in Philosophy and Social Criticism, Praxis International, and the New Art Examiner, recent short essays in the Hampshire Gazette and the Amherst Bulletin. She has also translated various articles and a book, Rationalities, Historicities, by Dominique Janicot. She teaches existentialism, Nietzsche, Sartre, and philosophy and literature, philosophy and film, and European studies. In European studies.
European studies too.
Two. Third speaker will be Gentry Sayers, who's an assistant professor and digital humanities director in the Department of English. He did his PhD at the University of Washington. His research interests are in comparative media studies, digital humanities, 20th century US fiction, computers and composition, and teaching with technologies. His work has appeared in Kairos, Computational Culture, the Information Society, Collaborative Approaches to the Digital in English Studies, Prof Hacker, the Resource Center for Cyberculture Studies, and Writing and the Digital Generation. He's got a forthcoming book in fall of 2017, Making Things and Drawing Boundaries, at the University of Minnesota Press. I'm assuming that title is still going.
That one's,
Yeah.
I agree to that one.
Yeah, okay. And he teaches courses like Introduction to Digital Humanities, Mapping Digital Humanities, Composing a Virtual Campus, and in CSPT recently, Media and Materiality from Marx to Barat. And lastly, Arthur Croker, who's a Canada Research Chair in Technology, Culture and Theory, and is professor of Political Science and directs PACTAC, or the Pacific Center for Technology and Culture. His recent publications include The Will to Technology and the Culture of Nihilism, Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Marx at the U of T Press, and Born Again Ideology, Religion, Technology, and Terrorism. He teaches communication and politics, media technology and politics, and again, recently with CSPT, Nietzsche for our times. Sorry, Nietzsche for our times. So, without any further
Hello and welcome. We were talking about how to segue into this panel, now for something completely different. So I think the modes and topics of this panel are going to be an interesting juxtaposition to the first panel. Now, since I am the one responsible for this panel topic, or at least partly responsible, it was a conversation, that brainstorming conversation that Emil and I had, let me frame my paper on Paul Celan with some context for the panel as a whole. So, songs from beyond the Anthropocene, language and language for the future. This title may strike you as somewhat clunky, oddly worded, tightly packed with too many concepts, and that was intended. Instead of focusing narrowly on one single topic, the panel is meant to present a constellation of concepts whose interaction frames a larger theoretical problem. So here are the concepts, right? So we've got language, songs, the Anthropocene, the beyond, and the future. Right? So how these concepts interact will be addressed in various forms throughout the panel. So at this point, let me just note that these are highly contested concepts, right? There is disagreement about when it began and what to call it. But one thing we do know, sometime in our history, 10,000 or 500 or 180 or 60 years ago, we entered a caesura. Now, the caesura, whenever we talk about a caesura, we are creating a temporal binary of a before and an after. But while caesuras are normally constructed retroactively from the vantage point of the after, looking back at the historical before, the peculiarity of our present historical moment, whether it began 10,000 or 500 or 180 or 60 years ago, is that we find ourselves located precisely inside the caesura. So one theoretical challenge is how to conceptualize that caesura. Anthropocene, Columbian exchange, Capitalocene, Petrocapitalocene, Cthulhucene. These are just some concepts that have been proposed. The other, and I would say bigger problem, is how to project our theorizing past the present moment to the after, which the caesura initiates. Hence, it's songs from beyond the Anthropocene. Actually, to be precise, we begin with the vision of songs coming to us from beyond the Anthropocene. So we're already with the title, trying to project ourselves in the after. So this then is a theoretical problem that this panel is meant to address. Writing after the catastrophe. Writing after the catastrophe. How do we conceptualize the catastrophe? How do we do so in a language that enables us to kind of puncture fissures into this boundary marker, this catastrophic caesura inside of which we are stuck? Whatever lies beyond is truly other. We cannot speak its other language. But can we conceive of a language that enables us to speak or to write ourselves towards that other space and other language? Now, this is not completely a new question that only arose in the context of debates about the Anthropocene. I think this problem of language, its boundaries, and the beyond is familiar to all utopian poets writing in dark times. In 1936, not quite yet inside the catastrophe of World War II and the Holocaust, but standing on the precipice, Bertolt Brecht wrote, "Truly I live in dark times. What times are these, when a conversation about trees is almost a crime because it implies a silence about so many horrors?" Writing about the catastrophe is writing about language, contemplating what can no longer be said, what needs to be said, and how it should be said. This meditation about language of and for the catastrophe, however, must be future-oriented. It must lean in the direction of those who will come and speak after. So Brecht's poem continues, "You who will emerge from the flood in which we have gone under, remember, when you speak of our failings, the dark time too, which you have escaped. The poem is called appropriately To Those Born After. Writing in 1968, well after the historical moment of the Holocaust, yet by no means having overcome the catastrophe, having only moved deeper inside it, or to put it differently, coming after, but still very much speaking with Bertolt Brecht, the poet Paul Celan writes the following response. A leaf treeless for Bertolt Brecht. What times are these when a conversation is nearly a crime because it includes so much being spoken? Celan here clearly radicalizes the problem of language in dark times to the point of nearly making impossible any conversation at all. Yet this radically censoring gesture comes from a place in Celan that urgently yearns for a language that can move us beyond. In Celan's poetry, this yearning expresses itself in an, at times, ecstatic failure of language. As for example, in the poem Corona. We stand and embrace at the window. They watch us from the street. It is time that they knew. It is time that the stone decided to bloom, that the haste turned a heart wheel. It is time to be time. It is time. I call this an ecstatic failure of language. Language fails fundamentally. It lacks the words to state what it means and can only resort to sheer repetition in order to at least make itself felt. But therein also lies the ecstatic utopian moment. Paradoxically, the repetition, it is time, emphatically anchors the present moment, affirms it, the here and now, but paradoxically as the moment that we move beyond. So this figure of writing the present as a gesturing beyond to what Celan often refers to as the altogether other, ein ganz anderen, is a characteristic feature of much of Celan's writings. As a matter of fact, the title of our panel, Songs from Beyond the Anthropocene, is a direct reference to another poem by Paul Celan, where the writing of the catastrophic here and now resolves itself in the ecstatic gesturing towards the beyond. Thread suns above the grey-black wastes, a tree-high thought grasps the light tone. There are still songs to sing beyond mankind. Now, I'll walk you through the poem in a bit, but just in case some of you haven't ever heard the name Paul Celan and don't know who he is, the world does not revolve around me and my research interests. So here's some information. The critical point is, so he is a Jewish German-Romanian poet who came of age during the Holocaust period. He lost both his parents to the Holocaust, himself survived a concentration camp. What is crucial is that he, on the one hand, was really kind of appropriated by post-structuralist philosophers of language as the hermetic poet of Poésie pure, which I hope I will deconstruct. And on the other hand, for the German literary historical context, he's probably the most important Jewish Holocaust poet writing in the German language. Okay, so this is really critical. Now, of course, I need to pause here. I can't equate the Anthropocene with the Holocaust or reduce it to the Holocaust. Right? I mean, the Anthropocene designates a period in the life of the planet where the human-caused environmental imprint is so significant and global that it constitutes an identifiable geological sediment layer. In the realm of the critique of ideology or critique of power, the Anthropocene, or whatever we want to call it, presents a theoretical framework for a multi-layered, systemic, political, intersectional, post-colonial, cross-species analysis of how to think about this moment in geological time. So one could therefore legitimately raise the question, what can the writings of a Holocaust poet contribute to today's debates about the Anthropocene? And what I want to propose in the time that remains is that Celan's poetry may present the outlines of a poetics for writing in and writing the Anthropocene. So let's return to the poem and let's take note of a little detail, a difference between the translation and the original. So the translation says there are still songs to sing beyond mankind. And Celan's poem says, es sind noch Lieder zu singen jenseits der Menschen. All right? So the translation uses an idealist concept, mankind, and so Celan's call for songs beyond becomes an idealist metaphysical affirmation, right? So even if the idea of humanity is lost, we still have poetry. So the beyond is a purely conceptual metaphor. In the German, Celan does not use that concept, mankind. That would be Menschheit in German. He actually uses the term Menschen, which is real people, human beings. Okay? So we have to imagine literally people, bodies, fossilized remains. Yeah? So the beyond is a conceptual metaphor because we still want to think how to get beyond, but it is above all a spatial and temporal metaphor. Okay? So for me, this is a much more disturbing juxtaposition of humans and songs, and that friction is what opens Celan up for inclusion and debates about the Anthropocene. And what makes him, I think, actually acutely relevant. So let's walk a bit more with the poem. What are thread suns? Okay, so I found some on the internet. This is when the sun breaks through the clouds. You don't see the sun yet, but the rays come through like threads. Okay, so wonderful. What are the gray-black wastes? All right. So in German, wastes, Ödnis, immediately evokes Genesis, where it says on day one, right, and I quote from the Torah, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. Now the earth was unformed and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters." In German, unformed and void is wüst und öde. So Ödnis immediately, the gray-black waste in German then evokes the first day, the moment just before the kind of boundless, myriad, manifold creation will fill that formless void. So we can imagine it like this. Yeah, so this vast, open, empty sea. But wüst und öde also refers, so this is just before creation. But it also refers to the opposite, the wasteland that is left behind after the devastation, after the destruction. So more something like this. Or, staying in the temporal reference frame of Celan, Hiroshima after the bomb, for example. So, the first line of the poem, "Thread suns above the gray-black wastes," could be this, right? The glorious spark of divine light that will begin creation, or it could be this, right? Referring to the aporia, the problem that we need to theorize about, namely how to reconcile the sort of layer and layer of catastrophic devastation that constitute the Earth's geologic surface with creation, right? So how do we do that in language, in our narratives, in our understanding of our human place in the vastness of geologic time? So Celan is relevant because of the poignancy with which he brings into relief the problem of the Anthropocene. Yeah? But in addition to kind of crafting his poems as articulation of this problem, Celan also offers us a way to read the earth. In his famous speech on poetics, on his poetics, the so-called Meridian speech, Celan insists that the poem must be mindful of its moment, and it must enact what in German is called die Akut des Heutigen. It must enact the acute stress on the present moment here. But the poem also needs to estrange itself. Quote, "The poem has always hoped to speak on behalf of the strange, on behalf of the other. Who knows, perhaps of an altogether other." Quote end. That altogether other is what Celan calls in the Meridian speech das Kreatürliche, or die Kreatur, creation writ large. So not humanity, but people, right? But creation includes people and everything else that is created, not just humans. And so in this struggle to situate himself as a poet in relation, and in this struggle to situate himself as a poet in relation to the moments of which he needs to be mindful, while also speaking on behalf of an altogether other, Celan very often resorts to geological imagery. Stones, mountains, crevasses, glaciers, boulders, debris left behind by retreating ice fields. It is in this process of reading these geological narratives, that Celan's poems bring us to the threshold where we encounter an altogether other thou. As for example, in this poem. So this is a really hermetic poem, supposedly. Eroded by the beam wind of your speech, the gaudy chatter of the pseudo-experienced, my 100-tongued perjury poem, the Noam, hollow world, free the path through the man-shaped snow, the penitent snow, to the hospitable glacier parlors and tables. Deep in the time crevasse, in the honeycomb eyes, waits a breath crystal, your unalterable testimony. I'll walk you through the poem. So the poem is very much about the search for the truth of poetry. It begins by rejecting the mendacity of what popularly goes for poetry, the gaudy chatter of the pseudo-experienced, 100-tongued perjury poem, the Noam. And it finds deep in the crevasse where time cleaves apart the unalterable testimony of a breath crystal. The search for the truth of poetry, which in this poem remarkably succeeds, very unusual for Celan, unfolds in this poem as a journey inside a glacier. Now, superficially or intuitively, we would think that nothing could be more inhospitable to life than the millennia-old ice fields of glaciers. Nothing can live there, right? But using the very precise language of scientific terminology, Celan reads into the glacier the hospitable gesture to enter and commune. This might not be obvious at all in the English translation, which seems rather surreal and abstract, hermetic. But the original German is a different story. We know that Celan studied intensely geology and glacier science. We even know which books he read and used as resource books. So in German, the language is scientific and quite precise. The glacier, you have to imagine, is a glacier whose tongue has already retreated. Right? We say glacier tongue in English too, right? Good. And what is eroded, right? So eroded by the beam wind of your speech, etc. So what is eroded? So the tongue has retreated, and erosion has removed all this sort of mendacity, the fake poetry, right? The false poetry is anthropocentric, and the translation is a little wrong because in German it's the 100-tongued my poem, right? So that sort of egocentric poem is kind of rejected, it's eroded, okay, it's blown away. And the poet retreats with the glacier beyond the human-inhabited, human-focused space into a different space altogether. So here's the second stanza then. Hollow world, free the path through the man-shaped snow, the penitent snow, to the hospitable glacier parlors and tables. Now you might think these are really weird metaphors, but they are actually precise German terms from glacier science. Okay, penitent snow, man-shaped snow, penitent snow is this, actually. It describes snow formations found at high altitudes. Right? They take the form of elongated sort of thin blades, they harden, and they kind of look like, it comes from Spanish penitentes, so people who are prostrating in prayer. All right. So, and glacier tables, okay, glacier tables are actually this, Gletschertische. They are when you have boulders, and then as the ice retreats, if it's still supported, it looks like a table, right? So this is actually the scientific term, glacier table. So in other words, glacier tables and penitentes are a hospitable space with companions that the poet is entering. And this hospitable space with the companions is formed by the retreating of the glacier, when the glacier is not yet gone, but in the process of retreating. So the glacier here becomes, so I'll just go back to the poem, and this is the last slide. The glacier here becomes a poet figure, or maybe nature, a poem of nature in the making. In the Meridian speech, Celan observes that the poem, quote, shows a strong tendency towards silence, but it holds its ground. The poem holds its ground on its own margin. It constantly calls and pulls itself back and from an already no more into a still here, quote end. This is expressed in the retreating tongue of the glacier who, as it gradually moves away, leaves behind an inviting and decipherable narrative. The more the poem moves inside the glacier proper, the more the poet's subjectivity is estranged, alienated, othered. Instead of writing about the glacier, objectifying, colonizing it, Celan, I would argue, has lost himself to it, until it is no longer he, Celan, but the glacier who speaks, its crystallized breath. So I see that I'm running out of time, so I'll just leave it at that, and I will just say this, that Celan's poems of stones and glaciers and ice fields and sediments offer us a way of walking the Anthropocene poetically in a way that displaces us while also giving us new spaces to rethink our position in the Earth's geologic story. So ultimately, with Celan, we would reject the anthropocentric reading of our imprint, and walking the Anthropocene with him, we would walk away from anthropos towards Kreatur writ large.
Wow. Wow, that's a tough act to follow there. But actually, I'm now actually almost shocked at how much interrelation there might be between our papers. So we'll see if you feel the same way. I guess, just to preface, I think that what I'm about to talk about has a lot to do with that, the way in which we, anthropos, right, think about knowledge and beyond, and how we might understand this human place and the other. So the motivation behind this comes, as Emil said, I work now mostly in philosophy and literature. That's really more my interest than before, when I did what was basically political ontology. And now I feel like what I'm doing is literary ontology. So motivated by a very long disappointment with how particularly academic philosophers saw the love of wisdom, I've always thought, you know, we really need to change that name. And then I found two people who gave me a way to think about changing that name, and lo and behold, it was so hip. They were both women and they were both Canadian. So I was all very excited about that. So my contribution here is to the Songs from Beyond the Anthropocene, is called Erosophia, my new idea of philosophy. And I guess it's kind of a love song, song from my own heart. And now I have to switch glasses because I'm really old, but I refuse to get bifocals, which means I can see this, but I won't be able to see you until I switch. Anyway, what does it mean to call the love of wisdom philosophia? So using Anne Carson and Jan Zwicky, who both go back beyond, maybe in the backward direction, to the Greeks, to reimagine the relationship of epistemology to ontology, of human knowing to what is, trying to reimagine that away from the model of identity and ideality, subsumption and control. They do this by means of an immanent critique focused on the erotic nature of thought as a yearning and bonding together of what is different. Both see this model as lyrical, lyric poetry and lyric philosophy. And I was thinking as you were talking that has a relationship maybe to the ecstatic, but I'll put that, that's not a word that I use in this paper, but we'll just earmark that. This is then another way I believe we can understand the love of wisdom as yearning and risk and openness, what I would call erosophia. So to call the love of wisdom philosophia is to make a particular ontological claim, whether you know it or not. And it's one that still governs our reason, our logic, our concepts. A philosopher is a friend, a philos, of wisdom. And so one's philoi are those that are dear to you, or those that belong to you, right? Your family, your friends, what is proper to you. And actually in Homer, in the Iliad, you even get the word used to refer to a body part, like my own dear heart, or my very own dear hand, right? But Plato, so think about what that means when you say philosophia. But Plato himself seemed convinced that the pursuit of wisdom began rather with an erotic attraction. In Book 6 of the Republic, he tells us that true friends of wisdom, how do you know who they are, these philosophoi? They are the ones that are in love, the word is erosin, they are in love with knowledge of the eternal. And so then lovers of wisdom identify themselves initially not by what they have, but by what they desire. And so they are first and foremost, I would claim, erosophoi. So, Anne Carson's extraordinary book from 1986, Eros the Bittersweet. By the way, I found out while I was doing my research, this is really bizarre, that both Anne and Jan Zwicky got PhDs from the University of Toronto, not just in the same year, but in the same season, from different departments, and they supposedly did not know each other. So I don't know if that's true, but that is just cool. It's like something was in the air. Anyway, Eros the Bittersweet is a meditation on Eros as lack. Eros begins its mythic life as a cosmic force of binding and attraction. It's the child of chaos who brings and holds Uranos and Gaia together, right? That's the Olympian tradition. Or in the Orphic tradition, it's a deity that's hatched from a silver egg in the womb of darkness to set the universe in motion. But Eros can only bind together what remains separate. The tragedy, this is the tragedy of desire, right? That the lover wants what she or he cannot have, because as soon as it's possessed, it is no longer wanting, and therefore the lover is no longer a lover. Which is why Sappho can call the erotic experience bittersweet, and the Greek word there is glukopikron. So Carson cites examples of the self-destruction of desire from Sappho to Petrarch to Sartre to Lacan. I mean, she just ranges wide. And of course, Plato, the ventriloquist. Erotic experience is not only tragic, though, it's an invasion for Carson. It forces itself irresistibly from without. Carson points out that most ancient poetic descriptions of the onset of desire speak in metaphors of war, assault, and resistance. And now I'm quoting: piercing, crushing, bridling, roasting, stinging, biting, grating, cropping, poisoning. It sounds like, what's that vampire movie? You know, the kids all have that. Anyway, in an erotic, what is that called? In an erotic encounter, we are opened up, expropriated, changed, twilight, that's one thing. That we're changed, expropriated, pulled along by our own need. Sorry. Having its source in the not me, Eros then is a curse and a grace that challenges the integrity of the self. Further, the movement of binding and separation is both substantial and temporal. Eros is an experience of the not me and the not yet. True logos, like true love, must be lived out in space and time. You begin at the beginning and submit yourself to the wholesale erotic takeover. To insist on the static eternality of knowledge is to be like the cicadas who sing in the background throughout Plato's Phaedrus, doing only what they love, singing from birth to death, as Carson says, stranded in a living death of pleasure. Like philosophers, the cicadas are creatures pulled into a confrontation with time by their own desire. So for Carson, the operation of Eros as lack and binding and reach, this tension of an acute and irresolvable kind, is an act of unparalleled erotic imagination. It's the same one essential to the metaphorical production of meaning and language, and to the production in ancient Greece of this phonetic alphabetic script. I'm not going to go into that, but it's really fascinating how she does that in the book. More importantly, though, she sees thinking itself as an inherently erotic movement. So Carson cites Paul Ricoeur. We may speak with Gadamer of the fundamental metaphoricity of thought to the extent that the figure of speech we would call metaphor allows us a glance at the general procedure by which we produce concepts. Unquote. So clearly this resonates with lots of folks, right? Heidegger, Gadamer, Ricoeur, Derrida, among others. But what interests me about this, and we can talk about this later maybe if you want, is that by going back to the Greeks, Carson, and I'll be doing Zwicky in a minute, a leapfrog back to an understanding of eros that's quite large and quite cosmic and way broad. It precedes Freud and his heirs and takes the whole conversation out. So it opens out the understanding of eros away from its circumscription by the sexual act and by sexual economy. So I'm just going to put that as an aside point and move on to Zwicky. So Zwicky, Carson's book actually is an example, I would say, of what Jan Zwicky calls lyrical thinking. So lyric, just to remind you, right, lyric comes from the Greek word for lyre, as in the instrument. And lyric poems were poems that were sung, as opposed to recited, like epic poetry, like the Iliad, right, that has a real rhythm to it. You clap it, like name, right? But singing it was much more melodic poetry, like Sappho and Archilochus. So yeah, melodic and resonant. In Alcibiades' Love, which is her recent collection of essays, Zwicky presents lyric philosophy then as an erotic operation grounded in the ontic desire for union with a meaning that precedes and exceeds thought. Intelligence is an eros that seeks to understand the resonant ecology, this is her term, resonant ecology, inherent in things, a meaning prior to and independent of language. So then truth, human truth, would be the as precise as possible expression of such resonance. It's a clarity that is larger than logical linguistic analysis, so this is her pushback, her challenge to logic and argument-focused philosophy. For Zwicky, meaning, like eros, comes to us from the outside. Understanding is founded on difference, not on identity. And this is best illustrated by Zwicky's explanation of clarity. And this is a long quote. The root of the English word clarity, according to Ernest Klein, is kla, or kal, K-L-A or K-A-L, a Proto-Indo-European base meaning to shout or to resound. Yeah, you can imagine. The old image then is not one that evokes control, either by the hand or by the intellect. It is not even visual. Think about the all-pervasiveness of the visual metaphor in the tradition of philosophy. Eidos, right? It just goes on and on. It is rather, that's not, back to the quote. It is an aural image, aural with an A-U, an aural image of sound as a physical force by which we are literally moved or shaken, with which we move together. So kind of reverberation. Clarity is something then like a call, but less polite. And philosophy then is thinking in life with clarity. So consequently, for Zwicky, genuine thinking is not an analytic, but metaphorical. One of her books is called Wisdom and Metaphor. Metaphorical thinking is the perception of that resonance that holds together distinct entities in intimate connection. Eros operates metaphorically in language and in thought, and it does in being as well. So that's her big claim, is that it's actually a reflection of what is not human. Those who think metaphorically, she says, are enabled to think truly because the shape of their thinking echoes the shape of the world. Thus, what is ultimately at stake for Carson and Zwicky is the way in which writing and metaphor reflect and enact the movement of thought as the erotic reach of the imagination, a movement of binding indifference. The phrase X is Y is metaphorical only when X is not Y. This is why Zwicky's writings have attracted ecologists. And in fact, there's a whole movement like lyric ecology. I have the book, and I haven't read it yet. Carson's book on Eros, The Bittersweet, ends with a claim about the erotic nature of thinking that is nearly identical to Zwicky's description of metaphorical thought. For Carson, we think by reaching across an erotic space, by drawing things together in a relation or idea, while at the same time maintaining the distinctions between them. That was a quote. Eros lies at the intersection of gathering and division. She's actually citing the old Greek words from Plato and Aristotle, synagoge, right, and diaresis. Thus, Carson claims, the same erotic ruse that she has uncovered in poetry and writing now appears to constitute the very structure of human thought. Which brings us to the Symposium. the eroticos logos, or the erotic speech by Plato. It's not, this is fascinating, for Zwicky it's not Diotima's lesson, which is always where the philosophers land, right? They always fly into the Symposium and they land on Diotima's speech. But it's not that, but Alcibiades' love that is the metaphor for philosophy. That's why the book is entitled Alcibiades' Love. When Socrates speaks, Alcibiades is transported, possessed, enslaved. He actually says enslaved. And that kind of possession, that kind of passion, it can't be willed. It has to come from the outside. All popular songs aside, song lyrics aside, we cannot make love. And so with understanding. But we can will attentiveness, openness, honesty, humility. We can know that we do not know. Rather than enclose ourselves in what Carson calls a carapace of Sophrosyne, touting a spirit of begrudgment commonly praised as virtue, ouch, we might, by means of a self-directed alenkos, be cleaned out, unclogged, and turned into the emptiness that is eros for the world. Socrates, Zwicky tells us, is the best of lovers. He loves without seeking to fill his lack. He embraces it. By loving without needing to own what we love, Zwicky suggests, we might achieve what she calls a Hegelian erotic sublation, a kind of Pyrrhonian skepticism that nevertheless continues to yearn. In the search for understanding, the structure of oneself is disintegrated in order that it might vibrate at the same frequency, matching its life to that of the world of which it is an integral piece. True love of wisdom on this erotic metaphor, then, would be a kind of love song of the mind, an act of absolute courage and surrender, Eros Sophia.
Oh, excellent. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to do that thing where I say this is a work in progress. The background for this is basically, so I do a lot of work. I was trained mainly in comparative media history and science and technologies studies at the University of Washington. So what I'm really interested in is the overlaps of cultural and critical theory with technological development, and in my case, technological development, like writing software, writing scripts, writing code. And so recently at conferences such as the annual American Studies Conference, several cultural studies conferences, and then coming up at the Modern Language Association in January, a group of other media theorists, Wendy Chun, Lauren Klein, Ingrid Burrington, several people from the School of Computational Poetics, have just been asking the basic question of, like, what does a critical algorithm study look like? And this is very complex because we want to get the question of language. Like, really, can you intervene, for lack of a better word, in algorithms at the level of writing and language? Or are we at a point where we're just using algorithms and the intervention is so difficult to make at this point? And so what I have here, I'm really trying to get to a song, but it's not there. I've been reading, trying to turn this into an article within this group on critical algorithm studies, and I've been surveying all the literature in computer, and what I'm going to talk about, computer vision and vision science, and it's just all really depressing. And so I'm trying to find, like, alternatives and songs that might kind of, new language that might come out of this. It could be a dirge. But you'll see that I'm still kind of grasping for straws here at what that language may be. And I did, after meeting with my fellow panelists earlier this week, I was inspired to rethink some of this language. So I've been starting to revise it, especially around the question of the Anthropocene and you'll see this in a minute, but what a face is in my argument. So that's a lot, but it feels like that's okay for today. So today I want to approach the question of the Anthropocene and language that was in our title through eigenfaces. These are faces that computers assign to us that are not our faces. More specifically, an eigenface is a unique face articulated by computer vision algorithms trained to extract, compare, and merge faces across image files. So here a face may imply the face of a human or a non-human animal, but as well surface properties of, well, basically anything. So a building, a plant, a landscape, an automobile, an illustration, a sculpture, whatever a machine is trained to articulate. And I use articulate there very purposely. In the literature, you're going to see a lot of language around recognition, but that just ontologically is deceitful. They're training machines to produce and then find things. They're not recognizing them in the environment. But this is ubiquitous in the computer science and vision science literature over the last 30 years, and there doesn't seem to be any suggestion of change. During this training, a computer vision algorithm applies principal component analysis to a set of images by first reducing the number of variables across all the images, so making them less complex, right? Caring less about accuracy and more about reduction. Then producing a matrix of variances, this is frequently in the literature called a covariance matrix, and then finally creating an eigenface from that matrix. These steps are repeated until millions of eigenfaces are stored in cloud-based libraries for repeated retrieval. Cloud-based, I mean like, the internet cloud, but just to be clear. These eigenfaces do not exist as actual faces, right, to be clear, in any lived social reality. Even if they can be purchased or downloaded as data, they do not belong to anyone. And just as an example of being able to purchase and download eigenface data, one of the most well-known face databases was produced by Columbia University. It basically gathered data from roughly 200 subjects in an uncontrolled environment without any kind of consent, just images on the internet. And it's one of the most common face databases used by researchers. To put differently, some of the research here is actually producing eigenfaces at the university level, let alone training the algorithms to read faces. These eigenfaces are the primary means through which computer vision algorithms not only draw boundaries, but also recognize, track, and save faces in our present moment. Importantly, people cannot perceive firsthand the procedures of principal component analysis in computer vision. Given their rate and mode of processing, they can only be simulated or imitated through prototypes and videos, such as, for example, Timo Arnold's robot-readable world. While speculative, this video gives us a sense of how machines may see and process their environments. It's especially helpful in instances where we may not know, quite likely, or care about, perhaps for many of you, the technical particulars of computer vision. So here's a clip. I'll give you a sense of what Timo's doing here. And the second half is going to be especially relevant. And this is, the aesthetic here is like a lot of Arnold's work, very dystopic. You see various other kind of videos like this, and there's often diagrams in vision science books around, basically speculative diagrams about what a computer does when it looks at faces broadly defined. As this video suggests, computer vision algorithms are a language of executable actions. They are written for machine reading and integrated into everything from social networks and prediction engines to surveillance cameras and drones. If you want to automate your use of Tinder, for example, then you can program it to find your preferred eigenfaces. That same algorithm, or branch of it, is also used in missile command systems for precision. Across these various situations, the cultural and social dimensions of algorithms remain difficult to study, in part because of their phenomenological and epistemological opaqueness, but also due to their frequent reduction to merely technical matters. Having acknowledged these issues, during the next few minutes, I hope, and I really hope, to demonstrate why critical algorithm studies, especially studies of computer vision algorithms, inform the Anthropocene and studies of language. While there may be hints of dystopia or despair in my talk, I am not going to speak about the apocalypse, the post-apocalypse, environmental collapse, or even science fiction. And those of you who know me, if you give me long enough, I'll end up talking about science fiction. And when I talk about animals, I will focus on the human variety. If you want to read probably one of the most excellent studies, you can read our colleague Nicole Shukin's recent book, Animal Capital, on the non-human variety. The most obvious connection then between algorithms and the Anthropocene will probably be my emphasis on the non-human. More specifically, I'm interested in how, to borrow from Deborah Bird Rose and Donna Haraway, algorithms perform a double death, or a killing of ongoingness so central to the Anthropocene and its very definition, which is based on the effects of human activities. Right. Again, I want to actually say both the causes and effects, but especially the effects of human activities and its anthropocentrism. As Haraway explains in Staying with the Trouble, the Anthropocene fetishizes the end of man, and I mean capital N man here. One of the issues I want to get at is the links between masculinity and early computer vision, instead of experimenting with ways of making with the world. Right. In my mind, algorithmic culture does something similar. That is, I think it also fetishizes the end of man, with important questions about how we think about language. So allow me to explain. According to various accounts, computer vision research on eigenfaces began as early as 1966 during the Summer Vision Project with Marvin Minsky, Seymour Papert, Gerald J. Sussman, and others at MIT's Artificial Intelligence Group. And they investigated how to use figure ground analysis to automatically divide pictures into regions and faces based on surface and shape properties. This region description would act as the basis for object identification, where items and pictures were recognized and named by machines with controlled vocabularies of known objects. So this was the vocabularies at this point were mainly written down, right? And they were, to some degree, relying still on punch cards. Cameras were attached to computers, this is in 1966, to achieve this automated description and identification with an express desire to eventually construct a pattern analysis system that would combine, and I quote from their last report, maximal flexibility with heuristic rules. Although computer vision has developed significantly since the 60s and 70s, the AIG Summer Vision Project marks a notable transition in the history of algorithms, a moment when researchers began integrating image processing into the development of artificial intelligence, including the training of computers to read, detect, and describe aspects of pictures and visual environments as eigenfaces. Throughout this process, the goal was to render computer vision autonomous. And this is key, I want to reiterate. So one of the key things here is that the computer, when successful, has to make decisions on its own without influence from the nearby researchers. At the same time, computer vision was modeled on human vision, right? Which was also normalized in the process. So it wasn't only based on how people saw, but it was also a very limited understanding of what human vision was, right? Thinking of Haraway's earlier work in the 1980s, for example, based on a very kind of God's eye view or objective paradigm of what vision is. So basically, Minsky and the AIG wanted computers to see and behave like they did, right? Not only faster and with more discrete output. In this sense, early stories of computer vision correspond rather neatly with stories about technology and industrial capitalism during the 19th century. Men with tools make history, and tools are, among other things, what Marx called dead labor, which feeds or acts on the living, yet remains a product and an effect of man. Right. Such stories of dead labor and the rationality and masculinity behind it are central to the Anthropocene, its human exceptionalism, I would argue, and especially its assumptions about agency. Since the 2000s, or the aughts, the ostensible autonomy of computer vision, again modeled on a normalized version of human vision, has invited numerous interpretations whereby algorithms and eigenfaces are somehow withdrawn from social relations and cultural conditions. And here I want to start basically marking off where the laboratory-based development of computer vision in the 60s and 70s and well into really the 80s and 90s starts to gain popular traction in the aughts and in our present moment. In philosophy, we might consider object-oriented ontology here. And in experimental media, the new aesthetic comes to mind. So Matt Jones, for example, Matt Jones is a media artist, suggests that eigenfaces correspond with a sensor vernacular aesthetic, or with optimized algorithmic sensor sweeps and compression artifacts. Somewhere between bits and atoms, a sensor vernacular aesthetic is an aesthetic born of the grain of seeing and computation. with David Barry pointing to a renaissance, for example, of 8-bit visuals, the emergence of pixel fashion, and generally speaking, a widespread obsession with seeing like a machine. So you might think of, I don't know, Minecraft combined with decimated meshes on something like Thingiverse, or Martin Bax's recent exhibition on pixel head fashion. Adam Harvey also has, that's circulated quite a bit now, something called stealthware that makes it difficult for surveillance cameras and computer vision algorithms to read your face. And then, of course, perhaps the most popular is James Bridle's various machines and their kind of romantic wanderings. So this one's based on various works of modernist writing, including work by Joseph Conrad. But what Bridle does, for example, is create characters out of machines, but really algorithms, and then kind of romanticizes them as something that we will never know. Whatever the label or example, such aesthetics have largely revised the notion of technologies as extensions of man to suggest that computer vision and the eigenface now supplant human vision. In this sense, they are at once humanist, anti-humanist, and object-oriented aesthetics. They throw the very notion of human perspective into relief, understanding computer vision as withdrawn, as beyond human access, as some sort of algorithmic unconscious. Yet at the same time, they demand consensus about what human perception entails in the first place. Again, they have to normalize perception. Much like the Anthropocene, I would suggest, they need the human to operate as a stable or ahistorical or normative or universal category in order to displace it. And in this case, to displace it with the computer's phenomenology. In the last instance, they are largely reactive in character. They tend to wonder at machine vision, much like I would suggest the Anthropocene tends to wonder at history, to suspend eigenfaces from their social dynamics without systematically intervening or even really reflecting on their cultural functions. So as such, the eigenface remains autonomous in these kind of new aesthetics. And to some degree, I would actually suggest, and I'm thinking especially of Haraway's recent work here, what we might call autopoietic, right? Within this kind of new aesthetic and object-oriented work, the eigenface and the algorithm ostensibly produce new visions and arrangements with and through their own growing data set. They're not only distinct from the rest of the world, they're indifferent. Returning to Haraway, they don't make with, they make on their own. And so this is if you want to trace it, I would say the 60s and 70s, and this starts to become like a neat history. So I'll make it a neat history first, and then I'll problematize my own history, and then I'll revise it. But for now, my neat history is the 60s and 70s. You had this assertion of autonomy of computer vision from human vision, but the computer vision is dependent on the human vision as a model. Increasingly, it starts to become more and more autopoietic, much like you would see in work around, say, cybernetics in readings that Catherine Hales was doing with the posthuman. So it's not only autonomous, but then it can actually start to produce its own visions of the world, or its own, and especially in more vision science language, its own data, and then learn from itself. And what I want to kind of follow that is then, where does it really start to enter into the domain of the juridical and the political, where we start to delegate decisions to it. That's where I'm going now. So, but the present day uses of computer vision obviously exceed the art world. So for example, in surveillance and forensics industries, reliance on eigenfaces enables predictive modeling and forecasting. And so I just have a screen grab here, which I'll explain in a minute. And as Haraway and others note, prediction modeling is fundamental to the Anthropocene. So you can think of like climate change models, right? And this idea constantly that you need to speculate about the future, ironically with a lot of data. And so she wonders, and staying with the trouble about the idea of like actually maintaining a sense of what you can't know and relishing in that kind of unknowability of the future, which seems to be eclipsed by the Anthropocene. But in these kind of predictive models, snapshots are extracted from video cameras and then stitched together to articulate, and this is from the language of surveillance industries. I'm looking specifically, I'm trying to figure out the exact reason for this, but most of the research is coming out of Florida. I could probably figure that one out, and in northern Italy. And there seem to be industry collaborations across those areas. I think with a history in development of war technologies, especially for submarines and drones, but I'm not sure. But they're referred to as people trajectories, which both archive and anticipate people's movements over time. And so they do a lot of data where they basically start to record where people are going, and the cameras have been integrated with face recognition technologies. to then anticipate what people will continue to do over time and police accordingly. And so this essentially becomes the kind of paradigm for preemptive policing, right? You start to police an area before crime even happens. And as one might imagine, they relied quite heavily on the camera data. Here, the image processing tradition of photogrammetry. Photogrammetry is just the use of 2D images that you stitch together into a 3D model. Usually 50 images, for example, of a building can help you produce a physical, depending on the size of the building, can help you produce a 3D model of the building itself. But the image processing tradition of photogrammetry is clearly linked with artificial intelligence research. As computer vision stitches together eigenfaces and tracks them, it also learns from them and makes suggestions based on them, most recently in real time. The programmatic description and reconstruction of the physical world are thus directed at the past as well as to the future, only heightening their influence. And so here, in this kind of shift, if you will, from the autonomy of the 60s and 70s to the kind of autopoetics of the aughts and then into our present moment, I want to think about specifically what Anish calls algocracy. Anish basically links this expansion of algorithms to a new kind of power and governance. And this is in Anish's book, Virtual Migration, which he refers to as algocracy, the rule of algorithm, the rule of code. Here, the programmatic treatment of the physical world in digital form is so significantly embedded in infrastructures that algorithms tacitly shape behaviors and prosaically assert authority through bureaucracy. So the everydayness of it is essential, especially for Anish in dealing with questions of digital labor across national boundaries. These decisions are delegated, knowingly or not, to computational procedures that, echoing the work of Wendy Chun, run in the background, vampire-like, as default settings. And so what I'm noticing in critical algorithm studies is the increasing lack of, for lack of a better word, persuasiveness of classical black box theory by writers such as Bruno Latour, where you're getting to a point where even if you can see or access the source code, and even if you can look at how things work, you're going to face an incredible limitation at trying to basically understand how algorithms are functioning, but also where all the source materials are coming from. And so I kind of want to close with this idea of an impulse or a new language for algorithms that wouldn't rely on this autonomy of computer vision, would think more expansively beyond autopoetics, so making things with algorithms, but would also think very seriously about the delegation of bureaucratic decisions in particular to and questions of surveillance and justice to algorithms. And I think this is fundamental, but we basically need language that resists dichotomizing media and mediation here, or digital and analog materials, or automated and manual labor, or, as I've really discussed throughout this paper, human and machine phenomenologies. At this time, working computer vision does not do this. And I've examined a bulk of the literature. And like in the Anthropocene, it appears grounded in an anthropocentric end of man. So again, the idea of not only delegating all of your decisions to the camera, but then also allowing it to make, in your absence or even after you're gone, allowing it to make decisions for you and perhaps more important, take responsibility for that decision. So I think to do so, we need a language about multiplying how people see beyond double death, to include algorithmic procedures without reducing them and machines to algocratic measures, to rational mechanisms of proof, or to autonomous devices for confirmation. Simply put, the language would not be humanist or anti-algorithm, but instead it would favor critical technical practice with language steeped in contingencies, so the negotiations that are occurring when these decisions are made. And again, this is very challenging to do in the case of algorithms. With such language, I hope we can resist delegating responsibility for questions of justice and social relations to the rule of code. Thank you.
A little bit out of the way, okay? Yeah. Three great presentations to follow. So I'd like to talk today about really, theme of my talk is pitilessness of this time beyond the human. The epical consciousness of this time is radically disruptive and for myself a deeply disturbing time of the 21st century, because I believe really already well beyond the language of the Anthropocene. For myself, that was always a deeply messianic, eschatological, totalizing, profoundly moralizing vision of the consequences of human willing. A vision which has already been literally overcome by the really epical event of our time, the overcoming of the human, the eclipse of the human, by our being gathered together under the sway of the simultaneously profoundly seductive but equally sinister death instinct that I would call the will to technology. Now Heidegger knew this. Thinking of Nietzsche, he called it our time of fully completed nihilism. Hannah Arendt also, she wrote prophetically that ours would be a time of what she called negative being, a coming culture and society of self-destruction, self-abnegation, and self-denigration. What George Bataille would come to call a future society, would live on the dying energies of its own sacrificial excesses, on the dying energies of its own sacrificial and excremental remainders. You know, those disposable bodies, deterritorialized economies, dishuman labor, and weaponized memory. So then, like a quickly fading star, it gives way to one final brilliant stellar explosion in the nighttime sky just before its fatal implosion into just another black hole in the traces of time. Symptomatic signs of the fantastic technological energies surrounding the death of the human are everywhere. Think of them. The externalization of consciousness that is the technological ablation. 50 years ago, Marshall McLuhan called it this, the radical surgery without anesthetics on the human nervous system that is the world of technological media of communication. Or the literal junking of the materiality of real human labor that is the approaching promise of the coming immaterial world of artificial intelligence. Or the present times, the socialization of affect, represented by the triumph of mood-altering technologies, the so-called society of connectivity, that is the world of social media. In the coming future of highly concentrated, massively congealed pools of cynical power surrounding predatory capitalism and nihilistic militaries, fluid pools of libidinal power, which work presently to prohibit, silence, and exclude the formation of any counter-language, any counter-public that would seek to rise into visibility, those who are forced into invisibility, or who would seek to represent the politically unrepresentable, or to make tangible the elusive, the enigmatic, the fluid, the paradoxical, in this coming time beyond the human. So then, the beginning of my lament, my hyper-lament for a time beyond the human, a lament which ironically begins with that most fundamental, most singular of all human assertions, an ethical refusal of the political logic and technological logic of the times in which we live, a refusal which carries forward into contemporary history, the existential spirit of Albert Camus, and he said in The Rebel, I rebel, therefore we exist. So my lament today goes something like this. It's called Islands of Sorrow, Ships of Despair, Refugees in Flight, White Nationalism, and Spectacles of Terror. Seemingly everywhere, the high energy of predatory capitalism and the world-flattening speed of digital globalization have brought to the surface ghostly remainders of a past which is now suddenly the future. Nativism, nationalist rivalries, ethnic grievances, really long suppressed religious visions, and long neglected class inequities. Here Nietzsche's aphorism, let the dead bury the living, finds its fulfillment in the form of 21st century politics and society that literally daily tries to wall itself off from the gathering storm with its spectacles of terrorism, with its surges of resurgent white nationalism and visceral politics of rage. All the while in the background hum Digital capitalism preps for the real world of clones, drones, and androids, while those excluded, prohibited, and disavowed, refugees and seekers of asylum and nomadic flows of the dispossessed, are forced to gather together on ships of despair and islands of sorrow, in flights of desperation. Refugees in flight. On July 19, 2013, in a joint press conference with Prime Minister Peter O'Neill and Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, at that time Kevin Rudd, they detailed what they called the regional resettlement arrangement between Australia and Papua New Guinea. For myself, it was deeply sinister. The policy ran like this in the press announcement. From now on, any asylum seeker who arrives in Australia by boat will have no chance of being settled in Australia as refugees. Asylum seekers taken to Christmas Island will be sent to Manus and elsewhere in Papua New Guinea for assessment of their refugee status. If they're found to be genuine refugees, they will be resettled in Papua New Guinea. If they're found not to be genuine refugees, they may be repatriated to their country of origin or be sent to a safe third country other than Australia. These arrangements are contained within the regional resettlement arrangement signed by myself and the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea just now. I read this and I thought to myself, what explains the epidemic of really visceral political rage directed against contemporary seekers of asylum and against refugees in panic flight from murderous violence, from sexual violence, and from violent extremist campaigns based on religion, ethnic, and political difference? Just everywhere, there's the same pattern of cruelty and indifference. In the United States, in the very shadow of the Statue of Liberty, special executive orders directed against Muslim immigrants in general, but specifically against refugees in flight from the slaughterhouse of human rights that is Syria. In Britain, a popular white nationalist electoral rebellion on behalf of Brexit, the psychologically fueled by the rage of white English nationalism against Muslim immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. In the European community, a concerted effort whether by walls, detention, force of arms, or bribes to insulate itself from those fleeing from warfare in the global south. In Australia, an ongoing experiment in the political and hence ethical disappearance of refugees, with politics intended to prevent asylum seekers from actually entering the territorial space of Australia. Policies of outsourcing refugees to mandatory detention centers in Manus and Papua New Guinea, or policies of imprisoning refugees on prison ships, permanently floating offshore like a 21st century incarnation of medieval practices of exclusion. And at home, in Canada, for all of our cherished official political optics, as a place of welcome refuge, there remain morally sanctioned policies of indefinite detention and specially designed centers of imprisonment of those in flight often from abusive violence and death and mutilation in the global south. So then, from the southern borders of Manitoba to Quebec, the Canada-US Safe Third Party Agreement serves as a convenient institutional arrangement for denying the ground reality that the United States today is, as a matter of Trump's anti-immigrant and anti-refugee policy, no longer a safe country of asylum for refugees and asylum seekers. In country after country, always variations on the same pattern of public morality. The effective criminalization of asylum seekers, the literal disappearance of refugees, the outsourcing to the new penal system, of those in flight from fear or hope for compassion, are seen as placing seemingly unacceptable demands for an ethics of care or responsibility on a system wagered on an absolutist politics of pitilessness. Beyond questions of securing borders and faltering sovereignty, perhaps we're confronted here with something at once more basic to the human condition in the current century, and definitely a tendency that I believe will only proliferate in its ethical magnitude as future years unfold. Namely, what happens when refugees and asylum seekers from the real majoritarian population of the world, the apparently unassimilable remainder, actually come into physical contact with the space of the ruling codes of economic intelligibility, of political self-interest, and morally prescribed white righteousness. Perhaps what we're witnessing in these episodic incidents of mandatory detention of refugee claimants and physical disappearance of asylum seekers are the first notes of a new executioner's song, a song that is as morally indifferent as it is politically indignant. Now, while it's tempting to describe such official violence against refugee bodies, the bodies of the unexpected, the unwanted, the uninvited, in terms of resurgence of bunker archaeology, that is, the highly defensive walling off of zones of economic privilege from the violent perturbations of the global south, that is, I believe, not really or just the case. In a way that's both more politically complicated and ethically perverse, refugees and seekers of asylum are not so much simply excluded as compelled to occupy the highly equivocal space of possessing two bodies of signification. They have a physical body with an earthly history of flight from fear and poverty and violence, but they also are inscribed with an increasingly phantasmatic body with a morally designated scapegoat, viewed as potential carriers of terrorist embodiments of economic anxiety. While the physical bodies of refugees, whether individually or with spouses and young children, are the constant object of physical exclusion and indefinite detention, the phantasmatic body of the scapegoat is just the reverse. It's not only permitted to enter deeply into the symbolic language of domestic power, but it actually comprises a viral invader, viewed as circulating in the deepest psychological recesses of the imaginations of the domestic citizenry. Like all of those phantasmatic outsiders before it, the threatening other, the outsider, the alien, the savage, the stranger, the refugee today occupies a symbolic position that is both interior and exterior to power, simultaneously an object of exclusion, but at the same time an enabling condition for the moral cohesion of really politically indignant and viscerally rageful domestic populations. So then, refugees and seekers of asylum are forced to occupy this highly equivocal space of having two bodies simultaneously. The physical body, biological, with an earthly history of fear, poverty, and violence, but also the highly coded body of the officially designated scapegoat. The refugee and asylum seeker is both victim and scapegoat. While their physical body will be forcibly excluded, their scapegoated body would be allowed to enter deeply into the cultural psychology, the political psychology of the domestic population. It's a scapegoated body that gives rise to the loudest, most persistent blasts of moral resentment. Here, popular rage directed against outsiders provides moral cohesion for fearful domestic populations, both driving the rise of increasingly authoritarian forms of politics, but also psychologically enabling the rebirth of the authoritarian personality as the normative basis of contemporary political intelligibility. Now, in his really insightful book on Frantz Fanon, a book called Fanon's Dialectics of Experience, post-colonial theorist Ato Sekiotu argued that this is our situation. I quote, "An omnivorous transnational capital that requires repressive local agencies to discipline the populace into acquiescing to its draconian measures. A free market of material and cultural commodities where necessary conditions of existence is the authoritarian state. The incoherent nationalism of dominant elites who are in reality transmitters and enforcers of capital's transnational aims. In other words, a coming alliance, a coming future of transnational capital dictatorship and local privilege." However, my account of those islands of sorrow and ships of despair indicates that the contemporary situation with respect to power and resistance may be more complicated than this. Perhaps really the persistence of racism and growing class inequalities and continued discrimination on the basis of gender and sexuality has produced a new global situation. Certainly a continuing alliance of transnational capitalism and local privilege, but also the piling up seemingly everywhere of surplus bodies, originating a new alliance of power and resentment, even anger, on the part of the world's most privileged populations, and is directed against the poor, the weak, the vulnerable, and the powerless. And something else as well, namely the increasing projection of phantasmatic identities on the bodies of those who resist, the specter of the foreign terrorist, the unwelcome immigrant, the environmental activist as viewed as threats to national security, indigenous resistance, defined by the RCMP as terrorism. In addition, there's also research and suspicion that the security of the homeland has been undermined from within by homegrown terrorists, undetectable, messianic, the new direct action assassins. Literally everything begins to intersect under the sign of power. Power intersects with a much older story here of racial exclusion. It's never transnational capitalism, but now transnational capitalism that works to support certain forms of racial intelligibility. It's never resistance in its own terms, but political resistance that sometimes intersects regressively with the politics of anger and white privilege, and sometimes resistance that intersects progressively with challenges to racial domination, class inequalities, gender discrimination, and anti-democratic forms of governance. But always, of course, the predominant moral fact of contemporary times, the epical consciousness, the literal disappearance of the globally dispossessed from the ethical intelligibility of the times in which we live. When the shadow of nihilism falls on contemporary consciousness, it most often takes the forms of reducing into very real public invisibility the all too human existence of the new wretched of the earth, with their contingencies of despair and their trajectories of hope. So I'll conclude. In this case, 21st century politics traces, I believe, a strange trajectory that mixes technological shards from a future that will probably never be realized, with emotional appeals to a past that has still not lost its hold on the contemporary scene. Politically, the mood of the time seems to veer between tangible signs of exhaustion, cynicism, and self-denigration in the ruling centers of power, and violent, virulent forms of predatory behavior that translate resentment and anger and despair into violent aggression against the weak, the vulnerable, the powerless, and sometimes in that strange and really strange political boomerang that is Brexit in the UK and Trump supporters in the US, real aggression which is directed against the previously ruling neoliberal governing elites. Could it be that we're living in an emerging epoch of what Jean Baudrillard described as dead power, a scene of excremental power, in which all the ruling signs implode in an endless drift, sometimes taking the imminent form of spasms of nativism, and other times finding expression in the transcendent projects of globalizing neoliberalism. Almost 3 decades, after all, after the collapse of the eclipse of communism as a hegemonic ideology, and 15 years after the still unexplored events of 9/11, nowhere is the presence of dead power as the governing motivation more clearly than in present US presidential politics, with this binary choice between fully exhausted neoliberalism on the one hand and right-wing populism with a fascist streak on the other. Your political debate is framed by only apparently opposing alternatives. On the one hand, globalizing capitalism fueled by favorable transnational trade agreements and fully intent on destroying the democratic power and economic fungibility of the working class, seemingly everywhere, aligns itself with the ruling star, the rising star of the digital commodity form. A new global world order of supply chain capitalism, abstract codes, massive data archives, artificial intelligence, and mass subjectivity moving at the speed of social media. On the other hand, though, an equally pro-capitalist popular rebellion under the angry sign of nativism that seeks to take shelter from the gathering storm of globalism by building bunkers, sometimes draconian border bunkers of no immigration, other times security bunkers of no terrorism, even now gendered and racially constructed bunkers for sanitizing the future against questions of racial, ethnic, and sexual difference. So then globalism and nativism, just as two sides of the same coin, one transcendent, the other imminent, one favoring the new global class of technocratic specialists and owners of the means of digital production, the other more defensive with its rebellion on behalf of displaced workers and angry white citizens and always culturally threatened white males. The one expansive, smooth, outward-looking, the other inward-looking, anxious, driven by what the philosopher Martin Heidegger once described as the malice of strife against both nomadic immigrants and globalizing elites, with intense outbreaks of new forms of hatred of existence directed against those challenging the new social purities, whether Black Lives Matter in the streets of the United States or against democratic dissenters everywhere, or against a growing public visibility at the poor and the vulnerable, or against gender and sexual code breakers. Consequently, we may be living in the early years of a new form of predatory colonialism, one animated on the surface by fierce struggles between the ascending and descending sides of the 21st century capitalist regime, but which for all that unifies in stripping a language of political and economic intelligibility of all that is remained of the contemporary political regime. I conclude then, a truly cataclysmic situation where contemporary politics can be so intense because it just splits perfectly between two perfectly fake futures. On the one hand, a powerful upsurge seemingly everywhere of right-wing populist movements under the classic signs of white nationalism and spasms of mean-spirited anger and always energetic flows of raw capitalism. On the other hand, the broken project of what might be described as first stage or incomplete globalization, which continues to be defended by global technocratic political and financial elites, really deeply nostalgic for the now superseded days of unipolar American power and privileged technocratic specialists and unchallenged digital capitalism. Lost in the media blast surrounding these two fake futures is any necessarily complicated public discussion of those disavowed by attempts to purify markers of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality, those growing sectors, the working class, excluded by primitive capitalism, functioning in the language of outsourcing, offshoring, and austerity, those of the middle class soon to be made redundant by technologies of automation and artificial intelligence, and those immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers prohibited from moral recognition as human beings in a future that grows triumphantly inhumane. Fake futures then for a world and a real world under stress. Fake purity for a social reality volatilized for the deep abiding and continuing intersections of all the signs of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. Fake politics for a future featuring spectacles of terror against the steady background now of raw capitalism as it moves quickly and progressively to the right. Thank you very much.
Oh, now I'm gonna crawl under the table and
That was a song.
lament.
So, we're free to ask questions. You can ask each other questions as well.
You can just comment.
Can I just
Yeah.
throw my ignorance in? Oh, just like, well, what a panel. It's just lots of things and to think about. And it's, I'll go to Elena first. Yeah. The language, it was beautiful opening, of the kind of bringing out the meaning from those poems that we got. It was so beautiful. I mean, the poem was beautiful. The logo with the images is very beautiful, and it's just some reflection. I don't have something to say, but starting with the dark poem, in the dark times, and then going through Paul Celan's poetry. It's just the fact that he committed suicide, and then he gives these images that there is still possibility for having a voice, or having that, having something, a language is something that can come out, but from somewhere that is deep in that glaciers, the space, the making that such a inhospitable space, but turning it into a hospitable place that you can still have. It reminded me of Benjamin's that hope is for the hopeless, and he lived it. It's sure like his life is as it feels like that he lived it and he died as the hopeless, but there is a hope. So the place there is a place for and space, possibility of language, possibility of coming out, although it's so hopeless.
Yes.
And that goes back to the dark times and showing that little bit of a hope in the dark times. And then coming with this, ending with these things of the lament is like there is no hope, or we are stuck in that space, in this present space that we're trying to find some language or some possibility of we can have an image in imaginary. We don't read the possibility of creating a new imaginary for the future. It was just beautifully sewn together with in the middle all of these things. I'm just giving a reflection, but that was very nice.
Thank you.
Spoke to the whole question, which I can pitch my own thing in. Can I just?
Pitch away.
Yes. My research was on getting from Levinas, bringing his ethic of the other and desire for the other as something that would be opening a way into this space of the hopelessness, a space of the possibility in the human subject, that there is this possibility within the subjectivity which goes through all of what you have showed here, and that you have this potentiality of being for the other. You have this, and then it comes. So I see the hope for me is the hope of getting to the other, to the future. Is through that, maybe not uncovering, but creating an imaginary that brings that ethic for the other into the political scene. Not just the right for the self or different identity, but getting into this of being for the other. So it's just something I'm just adding to that thing.
We need to talk.
Yeah, I know. No.
We need to talk. So what you're saying about the ethics for the other, kind of, I guess I'll pitch the rest of my research. So there's this fascination with Brecht and Celan. Like this is sort of it kind of started with Brecht and Kafka, where in the end I came up with this notion of an ethics of responding. And so this sort of, I'm trying to figure out this idea of the moment. Because Celan in his speech, this Meridian speech, he talks about, well, how do I position myself? Do I position myself in, this is linguistic language, the gravis versus the acute, so this is how do I place the accent, and so the gravis of the historical, oh well no, I will place my accent on the acute of the present. Now, why is that an ethical moment, and how does that all fit with glaciers? This is going to be a huge article or a book. I'm still trying to figure this out. But snow. So we can't talk about trees anymore in dark times. It's a crime to talk about blossoming trees and stuff when there's all this murder. What do we talk about? We only have nature. And so in the absence of trees, what we have is snow. And so snow becomes this new space to construct a poetics for dark times. So there's something special about snow because it can kill you, right? But it's also, it might also put you in the moment of having to decide ethically, here and now, what to do with the snow. So there's a poem by Brecht, for example. It's spring, Easter Sunday. the good message, right? And he's describing himself, ranting in a poem about all the crimes that are happening. And as he's doing that, there's a sudden snowfall, and his young son, comes in and takes him away from his desk, because out in the garden is a very young apricot tree. And so silently, they cover it to protect it. So so here's this angry poet, right? I mean, j'accuse. But the real ethical moment where they prove themselves as humans, right? Ethically, as ethical agents, is when they are silently covering the tree to protect it from the snow. So the snow, it can get you in both ways. You can ignore it, and then the tree will die, right? And you can keep on decrying all the crimes, right? Thinking that you're so moral. But so there's something very special that happens in this weird material of snow, which can change its properties depending on slight environmental changes, right? I mean, it's a crystal. A diamond is a crystal. It's indestructible virtually, but a snowflake, it can just disappear completely. It can change its ontology, right? So that's what fascinates me. Somehow, snow becomes this new medium for poetics where you constitute the present moment as an ethical decision. So,
and that actually, that's what you see, it's exactly the moment of getting out and see the tree.
mm-hmm.
That comes to what you, Nina, finished with, the desire, and the desire of, that is not then feeling the lack. It's then again of bring Levinas, and for Levinas, desire is not feeling of the lack. That's the need, because it comes from the self. But the desire is that you always go out for what is outside, for the other. So you, exactly as we said, that when it's a desire for the not self to bring it in, then you don't have any desire anymore. Then it's it's finished. You're not a lover anymore. In that sense of the desire to that. Then the ethical moment comes in that space that the desire turns from being self in the feeling to the self as a self that is supposed to be fulfilled, or being self total. So if we move out of this myth of a total self, that it needs to be filled up, and then the desire, then it's not coming from this for the self, but for the other, and then we move on. That's the ethical moment that can come in and open the space for hope. I'm just
and dwelling in the temporality of that, right? That's sort of the moment as that sort of emptiness towards the future. But part of what I didn't talk about was how the word philos really holds the Platonic ideology, right? That because it's such a bait and switch in philosophy, right? You're supposed to love wisdom. You're supposed to go out and seek knowledge of the world, and in the end, you can contemplate the forms because the soul is eternal like the forms, and so it ends up being, what do you want? You want to have.
Yeah.
You want to possess. You want to dominate. You want to subsume, and that segues right into and goes all the way through into what the critical theorists would have called instrumental reason, and the sort of the relationship we have to nature through technology as manipulation, as control, and that possessiveness based on that sense of self-sameness, that sense of having, that's, presence, I guess I could say. I was going to say to you that Derrida actually talks about the response in politics of friendship. It might be, and it's always he has an interesting word, and I always forget what it is, meaning that it's weighed more. It's not equal. It's that the demand for response from other is heavier. It's more. It's ethically. I can't remember the word he uses, but it's wonderful. I'll find it for you.
But there's probably another problem now. I mean, because you have a poetic rendering of the concept of self, the concept of self has been technologically undermined. At the minimum, occupies simultaneously two selves. Real self of flesh and blood and bone and existence. But who here doesn't have a digital self that has a real interiority, really it is part of the a very human situation, it intersects with it, and it's at war with the human self. So there's two kind of antipodal things. So the very category of self has become problematic. In the philosophical, there's a problem with this, because Heidegger announces in his Reflections on Nietzsche that the epical consciousness of our time is we're coming into subjectivity. But we're all very post-Heideggerian, because we're jettisoning our subjectivity as quickly as possible. That's what the eclipse of the human means. And the new forms of, digital subjectivity begins to emerge and begins to overpower what Gentry so eloquently began to describe in terms of, the song of the algorithms, right? I mean, that's a real palpable, it's not object orientation. It's really technology coming alive, having real visceral senses and whatnot. So I just think that the categories of philosophy have to take account of the fact that they've been undermined by the language of technology, just in the simplest terms. And that would mean that things like hope and hopelessness, and loss of hope or hope, for myself, don't make any sense anymore at all. I go back to the Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno. I am I in the human situation, and the human situation is I. And I think it's a good starting point for a philosophy of these hyper real times in which we live. I think we should think splendidly, but tragically, into the complicated circumstance of the present, with all of its serpentine twists and things, which it's always been a project of theory to do that. So.
Then where do you put empathy? I mean, so if we have this, so the jettisoning of the subject, the creation of the virtual self, all of that kind of adds nicely to the whole idea of alternative facts and fake news, and ultimately it decorporealizes the real humans, and so maybe that is part of why we have this utter lack of, we have lack of empathy towards, those bodies that come swim ashore, and then we're angry at them that they are real bodies, right? I mean, I think that kind of plays to, that interacts with each other. So how do you, I mean, we can't re-seize subjectivity once we've jettisoned it, right? I mean, you move forward dialectically, you can't go back. But how can you, what kind of impulse can one provide to reopen spaces for empathy?
Well, I'm not so sure that you can't re-seize subjectivity. I think that's the real work circumstance of our time. I think part of human struggle should be to recapture the singularity of human subjectivity. Even admitting that it's been eclipsed by this inexorable apical consciousness of technology. And there are many among us who are comforters of the project of technology. They've gone over, it's a whole class of technocratic specialists around the world. Comforter class, they're sellouts of human being human in the most literal sense of the term. I'm not. And just in the midst of my studies of this, just been seized by this passion to really identify my thinking with those who have gone to their death. Paul Celan, Paul-Émile Bourgeois in Montreal, Breton, Antonin Artaud, all of whom have a common ethical project. And that project is to seize on the majesty and mysteries and empathetic qualities of the singularity that is a human being, the circumstance, with all of its prospects of tragedy, but also promises for human creativity. So,
for me in my work, I think I would tend to substitute empathy with responsibility and think about fundamentally in any kind of, say, I guess I'll use the word posthumanist here, posthumanist script that we're trying to think about the relationships between humans or human animals and non-human animals in the rest of the world, and the construction of algorithms that are meant to read the world. That you have to ask, how are you complicit with certain distinctions between this and that, or animal and not animal, or foreground and background, right? And to me, perhaps that's because I'm working with many things that to prompt me to consider how I could be empathetic with them would be impossible, right? I can't be empathetic with an algorithm. And I don't even think I could be sympathetic with one. Maybe some. But yeah, I mean, I think it is. It's really about like, I mean, Karen Barad's recent work, but also Mel Chen's work recently in Animacies. If you think about the entanglements of the language you use, the discourse you use, and fundamental questions of matter, right, in the being in the world, you have to ask how you're complicit with certain cuts or distinctions between this and that. And it isn't the kind of comparison point where you say, well, we will compare this and that, but rather, how did I make that distinction in the first place? And how can I be responsible for the distinctions I've made? And for me, most of the work is that the distinctions that are made are maybe in theoretical paradigms that would be described as post-humanist, but more generally, they involve some kind of algorithmic decision, right? And so how do I take, when I can't see how it's working, I can't rationalize it. And the people who are working and writing them don't even fully understand what they're doing, right? I mean, the degree to which something like a lot of those face recognition scripts call on existing cascades, they call all these files, and then they write on top of it. Like, they don't even know what they're called. Like, ontologically, they don't even know where they're starting. Like, you have to ask a different question there, and I think the question is, how have I decided to discern between this and that? Like, what's my responsibility in that distinction?
So this is like that, it's just what you're saying. I'm thinking about the iRobot, Asimov's the four laws of the. So it's probably is like recognizing that we're creating a language that is with its own self-referentiality can also take our subjectivity away from us and take the ethics and responsibility and everything else, and then go into that dystopia of space. So there's a real possibility. It's not just a sci-fi through the algorithm.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely don't think it's science fiction anymore. Yeah, but yeah, I guess I balk a little bit when I want to anthropomorphize the machines, right? But at the same time, I'm very skeptical, as I hope I showed, of the degree to which the history of algorithms in particular is modeled on human rationality, right? It's not, say, for example, modeled on affect, right? And there are a handful of people that have been thinking about, like, can you think about algorithms and affect together? Can you even begin to write like that? Probably, I don't know.
So that's what empathy was doing, right?
I think so. But most of the models are responsive. They're reactions to algorithms, statistical panic, right, of what's coming up and is at you at all times. You're responding to it. And to me, it's like, how can you flip it and think about not a reaction to algorithms, but the contingencies involved in producing them, if that makes sense.
So about 20 years ago, the US Navy began giving out very healthy grants to graduate students in the States to develop perverse algorithms. So
I'll look at this.
So I don't want to interrupt the discussion, but I have to. Because there's some warm food waiting for us
Now
outside.
that is uplifting.
But we're going to be back to watch Arthur and Mary Louise's video, and so we can mix it.
these are videos we did text and things, but these are by Jackson Two Bears.
Okay.
You know, Canada's leading.
They're only
young-
9 to 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Not going to be here for hours.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, but
It's not a feature film.
so I mean, we can definitely continue the conversation, but there's a brief. Okay, so welcome to the 2017 annual CSPT Faculty Conference. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that all of us here at UVic are visitors on the traditional territory of the Sandwich, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples of the Coast Salish Nation. Also, I'd like to thank you all for coming out and attending here and contributing, and especially to the panelists for agreeing to participate, and I'm looking forward to a great set of panels and question periods. So I'm going to present the speakers on the first panel, which is titled Liberalism, Secularism, and the State. And so I'll just introduce each speaker, and they're actually going in alphabetical order, so that's convenient. So first of all, Shikata Banerjee, who's a professor of gender studies. She got her PhD in political science at the University of Washington, and works on Indian politics, nationalism, and masculinities. Her titles, her books include, her many books include Muscular Nationalism, Gender, Violence, and Empire in India and Ireland at NYU Press. She's edited a translation of Scattered Leaves of My Life, an Indian Nationalist Remembers. And Make Me a Man, Masculinity, Hinduism, and Nationalism in India at SUNY Press. And she teaches Women, Race, and Empire. Another course, Imagining India from Empire to Bollywood, and Gender, Nation, and War. Our second speaker is Nilesh Bose, Assistant Professor and Canada Research Chair in Global and Comparative History. He's the faculty convener of the Global South Colloquium at UVic. He focuses on modern South Asian history from the 18th century to the present, on colonial India, histories of religion, empire, nationalisms, and decolonization, transnational history, global history. His titles include Recasting the Region, Language, Culture, and Islam in Colonial Bengal at Oxford University Press, and has edited volumes Culture and Power in South Asian Islam, Defying the Perpetual Exception at Rutledge, Beyond Bollywood and Broadway at Indiana University Press, and Manusha Adhikar of Human Rights, co-translated and co-edited with Sudipto Chatterjee at Seagull Press. He teaches Rising Peoples, the Struggle Against Colonialism in Asia and Africa, and World History, Empires and Nations. And lastly, Daramir Rudnicki, who's an associate professor of anthropology here. His PhD in anthropology was at Berkeley. His research addresses globalization, religion, development, Islamic finance, and the state in Southeast Asia, focusing on Indonesia and Malaysia. His book, Spiritual Economies, Islam, Globalization, and the Afterlife of Development at Cornell, was awarded a Sharon Stevens Prize for the American Ethnological Society. He teaches culture and money, anthropology of Southeast Asia, and anthropology of knowledge and expertise. So I'll just let you begin.
So I want to begin by pointing out that this is not a coherent essay, but a collection of thoughts based on my observations of contemporary world events, including the election of Donald Trump, the rise in anti-immigrant stances in Europe alongside articulations of hyper-masculinized nationalism, and the sweep in the recent state elections in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh by the Hindu Nationalist Party BJP, which put in place an extreme right-wing Hindu holy man as chief minister. With a population of 240 million, a BJP state government gives the Hindu Nationalist BJP government at the center a boost that will perhaps embolden this party to take stances meant to strengthen Hindu dominance in India. All of these political events are partially informed by a fear of difference, which is linked to the anxiety surrounding the potential disruption of or dilution of a liberal and or secular polity, however imagined. I want to approach this social anxiety that sits at the juncture of the tripartite relationship posed by the title of this panel through a gendered lens. Let me begin by referencing a volume published in 1999 titled, Is Multiculturalism Bad for Women? It contained a lead piece by famed political theorist Susan Oken, who argued that indeed it was. and followed by responses, usually rebuttals of Okun's cases by a host of academic stars. Okun's basic point was that multicultural policy, in whatever context, focused on public group rights, which erased what was going on in the domestic sphere, since women tend to be disproportionately be affected by cultural practices deemed private. Multiculturalism's protection of group rights has the potential to justify practices that negatively impact women. The usual suspects were used by Okun to shore up her points: honor killings, arranged marriages, veils, FGM, and so on. The rebuttals to her argument focused on the following points. The Quran is an essentially liberal and feminist document which is being misused by extremists. Okun is adopting a white savior complex which assumes a binary, white progressive feminist versus oppressed third world woman. Okun, as a self-professed atheist, does not understand that women may take on practices as a profession of their religiosity that may seem oppressive. Women choose to participate in these so-called oppressive practices. And finally, that the individual violence that Okun fears is already covered by the criminal code in most countries. Although published several years ago, this debate is quite relevant in the midst of anti-immigration sentiments arising in India, the United States, the United Kingdom, and some European countries, which centers around difference, and difference is usually articulated by how they treat their women and girls. Several aspects of the debate unfolding around the Okun debate strike me as relevant. First, although Susan Okun began with the notion that state action needed to resist problematic practice, in most of the rebuttals and in her argument, state action after a while slipped into the notion that liberal society had to approve of certain practices. And indeed, if deemed oppressive by some collective liberal standard, there was an implicit support for civic protest against such practices. I would argue that there is a difference between the state, as in France, stepping in and banning the headscarf, versus most French citizens approving of the headscarves, or if not, protesting the wearing of this. The state stepping in has a gravitas that needs to be challenged. But in the absence of state action, I am not sure that an ordinary citizen has to approve of cultural practices. For example, I may not agree with the religious practice of Hindu widows shedding jewelry and cutting their hair, or Orthodox Jewish women covering their natural hair with wigs, but as long as I am not lobbying for legislation to ban this, I am not sure that my agreement is required. Indeed, even if I organize protests against these practices, I will be within my rights to do so. The point I am making is that so much of the populist liberal discourse around tensions focusing on secularism and liberalism centers on folks liking other cultural practices, or the assumption if we just talk to one another, all difference will be resolved. Well, no, I have no desire to enter into a dialogue with a Hindu nationalist like the newly elected Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, and I'm pretty sure no amount of dialogue will resolve differences amongst us. The point is, a liberal state and society has to manage a diverse citizenry that may vehemently disagree with one another. It seems to me, however, that at times, especially in Canada, agreement and amicable dialogue is equated with a good liberal society. Secondly, many of the rebuttals, as well as Okun, seem to assume that there was a monolithic entity called the Hindu culture, or the Islamic culture, or the Jewish culture. This is true mostly when these cultures are talked about in the diaspora. Many folks, usually the ones that the state valorizes, who define these cultures, usually blend patriarchal elements into them, or erase fluidity or disagreements. How many Globe and Mail articles have I read about arranged marriages in Hinduism, as if arranged marriages were part of a static Hindu culture? This is a cultural practice and a cultural context that is contested, debated, protested, and challenged by feminists from different caste, classes, and regions of India, and in the Indian diasporas around the world. Thirdly, We can make the same argument about the headscarf debate. There is almost a rigid equation with headscarf and Islam. First of all, many religions, for example, Catholic nuns, Hinduism, Judaism, favor women covering themselves to indicate chastity, piety, and religiosity. But second, more importantly, the issue of the headscarf in Islam has been debated since the 1930s by Egyptian feminists such as Hoda Sharawi, Nawal el-Sadawi, and Moroccan scholar Fatima Mernissi has written wonderful, nuanced musings on these issues. Yet, neither in the Oaken volume or in the vast amount of ink spilled in the West about Islam and women have I read scholarship that drew on the work of these scholars to center the complicated history of Islam, headscarf, and feminism that unfolded in Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, and India. If we are going to have debates about how to accommodate difference and manage it in liberal societies, then please at least take the time to discuss difference in all its complicated aspects. Building on the arguments I just made, I want to draw our attention to a more global point that transcends these debates on difference in liberal democracies. Usually, when difference is coded as strange religious practices in a secular state, usually the debate on difference unfolds in two ways. One, in the West, strange religious practices are seen as a danger to a liberal secular state or society. Or two, in India, under the Hindu nationalist government, somehow Hinduism is equated with liberalism and secularism in an explicit manner, and all non-Hindu religions, usually Muslim, are read as anti-secular and anti-liberal. However this debate is articulated, women's bodies are at the center, be it marriage practices, clothing, ideas of honor, piety, chastity, and so on. And I'll give you an example from the Hindu nationalist, really strange approach that they have to liberalism and secularism. So when this UP chief minister came into power, is Swami Yoginath, he put in place what he and his governments called the anti-Romeo squads. And the anti-Romeo squads were somehow expected to protect women's chastity and prevent women from being sexually harassed on the streets of India. But what actually happened was these anti-Romeo squads took on the responsibility of morally policing young women that they saw as being out in improper ways with men that were improperly in relationships with them. And so there have been all sorts of examples of how these roaming anti-Romeo squads in the name of secularism, liberalism, equated with Hinduism and protecting women's piety, have been beating up and harassing young unmarried couples. So this is how weirdly these kinds of things can be mutated and unfold. Placing women's bodies at the center of the dynamic of difference as it unfolds within the relationship between liberalism, secularism, and the state is problematic. Indeed, when the discourse uses women's bodies as signifiers of chaste, chastity, purity, and authenticity within a particular context, the parameters of the dialogue is limited. Usually, if one uses the open debate format, and this is pretty normal, the ideas unfold as follows. On one hand, representatives of a religion argue that these practices signify the authenticity of religion as represented by modesty and chastity of female bodies, versus somebody else arguing that these practices are oppressive. Even if one rebuts this sort of dialogue by saying that women are choosing these practices, or that women take on these practices as an expression of their relationship to God and religion, no one has destabilized the equation of the female body with a discourse of chastity and purity and a symbol of the authenticity of religion, even in a liberal context. Given our socio-cultural context of moral policing and histories of sexuality, and I'm always uncomfortable with this construction of the female body, my own research on what I term muscular nationalism indicates that no matter how well-intentioned, this view has disturbing gendered consequences. Given migration spurred by global inequities and war, liberal polities in North America, Asia, and Europe will have to grapple with difference. It is time that we broaden this discourse by bringing in diverse voices that reside outside the Western Academy, and to acknowledge that we are not all going to get along amicably. Perhaps the best we can do is resist legislation that stifles difference and the roots of our democracy on a particular race, class, and gendered view of the citizen. Thank you.
I also will not present a paper of original research, but offer a few reflections on liberalism, secularism, and the state, and some of what I have to say follows, I think, from Shikata's presentation, in that I'm looking a bit more in specific moments in history that I think illuminate some of the similar issues that she had mentioned. So as I interpreted the mandate here, I felt that it's of interest for us to think about defining liberalism. What is liberalism? This question has been asked and answered by many in modern history, and perhaps all of us here are familiar with Michel Foucault's definition in The Birth of Biopolitics, in which he asks, what does the self-limitation of governmental reason mean? What is this new type of rationality in the art of government, the new type of calculation that consists in saying and telling government, I accept, wish, plan, and calculate that all this should be left alone? I think that this is broadly what is called liberalism. Now, many hours can be spent in exploring the intellectual history of what came to inform that conclusion, as well as what came afterwards. But today, I think what I'd like to talk about are some moments in history that point to the connection of liberalism, secularism, and the state that offer some points of reflection. But first, a few questions that enable this. Is liberalism, following that, let's say that definition, is it a way of life? Is it a set of moral commitments to human equality? Is it a form of governance that can describe, so a liberal democratic set of institutions, for example? Or is there a popular definition that actually is quite distinct from all of these other reference points? The way that a man on the street might respond if somebody were asked, what is liberalism? They probably would respond with some definition of freedom, some version of freedom. So to take the discussion into a particular direction, signaled by Shikata and then highlighted by a recent visit of Mayanti Fernando, an anthropologist of Muslim France, whose work I'll reference a bit later, I asked, what is the relationship between liberalism and Islam? And historically, I'll review a few points in this relationship and end with a reflection on two questions. One, the question I opened with, what is liberalism? And also, what is Islam? Both of these questions, I think, are very important in the contemporary world, given the state of the liberal democratic West and given the state of siege that much of the Muslim world is now in. So if we take liberalism to start with Locke and two treatises of government, the heralding of the social contract, late 17th century, we may find a range of notions about the limitation of a state based on consenting individuals who exercise reason. And one issue keeping in mind is that when liberal ideals taken from this point of departure later in the 19th century, so the rule of law, so-called free trade, rights of the individual, when they emerged, Europeans who proclaimed these ideals in many cases made sure to figure out how best to maintain an empire that would deny these options to colonized peoples. As Uday Mehta in his landmark work, Liberalism and Empire, shows, this denial was not merely happenstance. It was not, quote, merely episodic compromise with the practical constraints of implementation, but actually part and parcel of the program of ideas that was initiated by Locke, which posits a limit to political authority, which articulates the rights the state may not invade, but at the same time outlines a series of exclusions to the beneficiaries of these rights, as consent based on reason was a prerequisite for the bestowal of these rights. So many, the mentally unfit, in Locke's terms, lunatics and idiots, madmen, they would simply not be eligible for this world. And when we fast forward to the world of empire, the precedent for the modern state in its contemporary form, in a place like India, where lots of ink was spilled about the question of liberal governance, lots of people thought about these issues, we find not a predictable history but an outcome in which, even though some felt that liberal universalism could be implemented, some version of the rule of law for all human beings, some did feel this, but after certain moments, like the 1857-58 Mutiny Rebellions, as well as other moments that occurred in the 19th century, those in power emphasized not universalism under the law, but difference, as Shikata mentions in a later period. Difference starts to become institutionalized in the late 19th century, which prevented Indians both from being ruled in and inhabiting a liberal framework. In the words of the liberal official who served in India, James Fitzjames Stephen, 1873, wrote in Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity about whether the British in India were there to rule Indians as, quote, equal fellow citizens, fit to be entrusted with the functions of self-government, likely to be gradually prepared, as our own working classes are preparing, for full participation in the privileges of representative assemblies, trial by jury, and all the other palladia of English liberty. As we know from subsequent history, the answer to that question was a resounding no, and it was quite easy for a liberal to trace the denial of a universal dispensation to liberal ideas themselves. Now, one form of difference, again, taking a bit from what Shikata was talking about, that was seized upon was religion, and in particular Islam in the British Empire after 1858. Excuse me, as one recent work in Shahab Ahmad's recent work, who recently passed away, his magisterial What is Islam has argued. Islam is both a set of commitments and can be an approach to the world that has allowed Muslims to both be Muslim, vis-a-vis revelation, divinity, and faith, but also to search and to explore. This being a Muslim in a way allows one to ask a question about what it means to be Muslim. And historically it has enabled people to engage in various sexual acts, consumption of alcohol, listening to and imbibing of arts, music, poetry, and other forms, in order to ask that question, what it means to be Muslim, which for most of the history of Islam has taken that form of asking questions through poetry, literature. For example, the story of Layla Majnun, which is a story that throughout the Muslim world people can refer to. But once these two elements have been put into the category of religion, i.e. in a regime of difference, we are forced to see Islam in the terms of liberalism as it refers to a state. So a community identified by its numbers, its existence, and not the personal and irreducible communing with divinity. Now, seeing things this way has been promoted by many anthropologists like Dalal Assad in the anthropology of the 1970s and 80s, and in particular the works that he has put forth on the formation of the secular and genealogies of religion, in which he shows how the modern colonial state apparatus created a space for the demarcation of religion, in particular Islam, and that modern liberal secular states inherit this intervention in naming who can be Muslim and who cannot, usually by identifying personal law and legal regimes. Now, studying the contours of selfhood in the wake of this intervention has been done, with notable acclaim by many, like Saba Mahmoud in studies of Muslim women in Egypt, and Maite Fernando also, whom I mentioned, and the studies of Muslim French in contemporary France. And that is one way of thinking about this relationship. Another would be about how particular agents in history have read and interpreted liberalism. And here I would follow Shikata's mentioning of various Muslim feminists and others from the 1930s and onward, Moroccan and others, who have thought and written about these issues. And before I get there, just a key figure I think is Adam Smith, who in The Wealth of Nations prophesied that equality of some form would emerge between European powers and the rest of the world due to the changes that had been occurring since the 18th century. The great shifts of mercantile power and politics into a so-called liberal world order controlled by Europeans, but in the intervening centuries would, he claimed in the late 18th century, would lead to some kind of equality. Now, as Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, and he's talking about European empire, the consequences have been great, but in the short period of between 2 and 3 centuries which has elapsed since the discoveries were made, and this is about the discoveries so-called of the Americas, it is impossible that the whole extent of their consequences can be seen. What benefits or what misfortunes to mankind may hereafter result from these events, no human wisdom can foresee. And he goes on to talk in detail about what may happen, but he ends by saying the natives of these countries may grow stronger, or those of Europe may grow weaker, and the inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality of courage and force, which by inspiring mutual fear can alone overawe the injustice of independent nations into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. Now, Muslims in the era of rising European powers and waning Muslim sovereignties in the 19th century wrote a bit about this. Syed Ahmad Khan in India, to the itinerant Al-Afghani, or the philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, wrote about these issues. And one particular agent in history, Syed Ahmad Khan, 1817 to 1898, fairly close reader of Smith, and in particular his Wealth of Nations. And Syed Ahmad Khan wrote a bit about how India's history should be understood through Smithian glasses, and how equality was, in a sense, the goal of a liberal world order, could be guaranteed by a state. And as a Muslim writing on both sides of the 1857-58 divide, he was considered by some a, quote, loyalist, but he was also someone who felt that a liberal order, defined by a state of governance that guaranteed autonomy of individuals and the freedom of individuals to practice their religions as understood by them, was guaranteed in Company India and then also in Imperial India. For Muslims, he felt that British India was a so-called Darul Islam, a place of peace, not a Darul Harb, or a place where Muslims could not practice their religion. And the state of governance I'm outlining is one of the definitions of secularism that has been operational in modern history. And it's important to know that in India, this particular practice of sovereigns acknowledging and incorporating members of different religious groups as members of religious communities, not as abstract individuals, holds a very long pedigree and a tradition, and some argue goes back to the Mughal Empire itself, which was the precedent for the company in India and for the British Empire. And there are various others that I can mention. I just want to close with a few other comments here, but Syed Ahmad Khan is a 19th century figure, writing in the context of the rise of the British Empire. In the 20th century, an individual who explicitly mentioned his debt to Syed Ahmad Khan was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the first head of state of that experiment, the new unprecedented experiment in the Muslim world of the state of Pakistan. Formed out of the brute partition of colonial India, but ostensibly for Indian Muslims to be safe from domination by other groups, primarily who they saw as dominating Indian politics at the time, caste Hindus. But drawing upon decades of debate and thought by individuals like him, and the philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, who saw promise and pitfalls in a liberal modern state, Jinnah, in his first address to the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan in August 47, said, "You are free to go to your temples, your mosques, or any other place of worship in the state of Pakistan. You may belong to any religion or caste or creed that has nothing to do with the business of the state." As you know from history in England, conditions some time ago, were much worse than those prevailing in India today. The Roman Catholics and Protestants persecuted each other, and even now there are some states in existence where there is discrimination imposed against a particular class. Thank God we are not starting in those days. It's Jinnah 47. We're starting in the days when there is no discrimination, no distinction between one community and another, no discrimination between one caste and creed. We're starting with the fundamental principle: we are all citizens, equal citizens of one state. And he discusses a variety of other issues in the history of religion in England, but he says at the end, "Now I think we should keep in front of us as our ideal, and you will find that in course of time, Hindus would cease to be Hindus, Muslims would cease to be Muslims, not in the religious sense, because that is the personal faith of each individual, but in the political sense, as citizens of the state." Subsequent history of Pakistan and of Muslim South Asia more broadly shows, of course, a marked violation and contradiction of these values that were espoused by Jinnah, much like the alleged universalisms of the rule of law were, of course, never fully executed in the era of empire. But in the era of nation, and potentially today, if we live in an era beyond the nation or post-nation, in the intervening years since the post-colonial moment that was signaled by Jinnah and the work that I briefly mentioned by Assad and his intellectual descendants is upon us, I think scholars today are faced with the choice of being either disabled by and fully defined by the rhetoric and myths of liberalism and their contradictions, or to see in history the relationships, the conflicts, and the struggles on the ground at times in its own name, which I have tried to briefly identify through these individuals. As Uday Mehta and his work hints toward, and his much recent work in the field suggests, I think the task ahead of those attempting to make sense of this history is not to dismiss liberalism, secularism, or the modern state writ large, no matter how historically implicated they have all been with forms of inequity, hierarchy, and exclusion, but rather to reflect upon the forces that make liberal aspirations unthinkable even in the homelands of liberal orthodoxy. As Shikata has mentioned, I think as Dora, the forces of politics in much of the world, the United States, the United Kingdom, much of territorial Europe, don't even make a rhetorical gesture toward those liberal stances and ideals at times hidden by empire in earlier moments. And we may find that even the aspiration toward universal values, however hypocritically expressed in the era of empire, in the waning of the nation-state, may become a thing of history. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Emile and also for organizing and inviting me to speak here today. Oh, okay. And also thank you to my, sorry about that. I don't actually think I needed it, but thank you to my fellow panelists, two great papers. The title of my talk today is Illiberalism or Ill Neoliberalism. It's become quite fashionable since the twin tremors of the Brexit vote and the election of Donald Trump to proclaim the demise of neoliberalism. For example, writing in Dissent magazine, critical theorist Nancy Fraser has asserted that, quote, these electoral mutinies share a common target, all are rejections of corporate globalization, neoliberalism, and the political establishments that have promoted them. In similar vein, the public anthropologist Hugh Gusterson has asserted that these events were, quote, referenda on the neoliberal order, in which those on the losing end of globalization rejected neoliberalism. However, I believe that these hasty, presumptive declarations may be premature, especially when one considers the dynamics of the Trump administration in fuller context. Indeed, I would like to argue today that these voluble proclamations of neoliberalism's terminal illness rest on a conceptual confusion regarding the distinction between liberalism and neoliberalism. Further, building on the work of scholars who have analyzed neoliberalism, including my own work on Southeast Asia, I'd like to contend that Trump's election represents a novel configuration of neoliberalism, and probably one for which we don't yet have an adequate conceptual vocabulary. And thus part of my goal today is to begin the process of assembling a lexicon adequate to diagnosing this new strain of neoliberal virus. At the outset, I'd like to contend that the error in the analyses of Fraser, Gusterson, and their ilk comes from a confusion between liberalism, a political economic philosophy originating in the Enlightenment, and neoliberalism, which is of decidedly more recent vintage. As Michel Foucault describes in detailed fashion in his 79 lectures at the Collège de France, liberal economic theory emerged in reaction to mercantilism, the dominant economic theory of the 18th century. The classical exposition of revolutionary liberalism was Adam Smith's magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations. Mercantilism viewed trade as a zero-sum game and advocated increasing prosperity by severely limiting imports and increasing exports. And these views no doubt resonate today with the recent Republican conversion to what's called the border adjustment tax. If you read the US papers, this is the plan for tax reform, this thing called the border adjustment tax. In contrast, Smith's liberalism was premised on the notion that national wealth would be most effectively accrued through reducing barriers to trade. As he put it, quote, if a foreign country can supply us with a cheaper commodity than we ourselves can make it, better buy it of them with some of the produce of our own industry, employed in a way to our own advantage. Smith's endorsement of what economists have come to call comparative advantage was decidedly anti-regulatory. He wrote, the industry of the country therefore is thus turned away from a more to a less advantageous employment, and the exchangeable value of its annual produce, instead of being increased, must necessarily be diminished by every such regulation. For Foucault, liberalism is characterized by three interrelated features. First, what he calls barediction of the market, by which he means that the market becomes the site for the production of economic truth. Second, limitation by the calculation of governmental utility, in which government action is constantly subjected to the question of its own excessive intervention. In this sense, the state is subjected to what Foucault calls the internal rule of maximum economy, in which government seeks to maximize its effects while minimizing its costs. The best government, then, according to liberals, is that which obtains optimal power at minimal cost. And finally, unlimited economic development in relation to the world market. Thus, economic exchange is no longer conceived as a zero-sum game, as it was for mercantilists, but rather according to a logic of mutual enrichment. Foucault sums up his definition of liberalism as a technology of government whose objective is its own self-limitation. In Foucault's analysis, neoliberalism differs in certain fundamental ways from liberalism. Whereas liberalism seeks to set limits on state intervention in the market, neoliberalism subjects the state to market reason. As Foucault puts it, the market is no longer a principle of government's self-limitation, it is a principle turned against it. It is a sort of permanent economic tribunal confronting government. Thus, neoliberalism represents a far more radical reconfiguration of power than liberalism ever did. In its American version, represented by the Chicago School, and which Foucault calls anarcho-capitalism, neoliberalism entails the extension of economic rationality into domains previously thought of as external to the market. As he puts it, it involves generalizing the economic form of the market throughout the social body. Returning to Trump, clearly his trade policies are decidedly more mercantile than liberal. For nearly 40 years, promoting free trade has been an orthodoxy for American presidents. From Reagan to Clinton, from the Bushes to Obama, perhaps the most abiding consistency of U.S. economic policy has been opening markets to flows of capital, commodities, labor, and other factors of production. Indeed, both Democratic and Republican administrations have embraced the trade deals that Trump has assailed, from NAFTA to the WTO to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And Trump's illiberalism does not stop there. New rules that purport to be about national security contain more than a whiff of market protectionism. Take, for example, the announcement by the Department of Homeland Security in March that targeted Middle Eastern-based air carriers, prohibiting their customers from carrying on electronic devices larger than a cell phone. Notably exempt were American carriers. And this prohibition occurred at the same moment that U.S. airlines had been arguing for limits on the ability of those in the Middle East to have access to U.S. routes, alleging unfair economic support for firms such as Emirates, Qatar Airways, and Etihad. Under the guise of national security, the Trump administration effectively downgraded the appeal of Middle Eastern carriers. However, at the same time that the Trump administration has bucked nearly 40 years of free market liberalism, its economic outlet resonates deeply with neoliberal dispositions. He and his advisors and appointees recurrently valorize private enterprise, express deep suspicion of government regulation, and zealously embrace an enterprise model in which state functions are run, quote, like a business. Witness his appointments. Betsy DeVos has been a longtime advocate of subjecting public education to market forces. The erstwhile nominee for Labor Secretary, Andrew Puzder, was a vehement critic of labor regulation and minimum wages. Scott Britt, head of the EPA, views environmental regulation as an impediment to commercial activity. In a February address to the Conservative Political Action Conference, Trump's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, asserted that the administration was dedicated to the deconstruction of the administrative state. Those were his words. In sum, Trumponomics seems to fit within the mold of a permanent economic tribunal confronting government. The pro-business message has been enthusiastically embraced by the Trumpetariat, the white working-class voters whose support was pivotal to Trump's victory, or so the mainstream media tells us. During the long campaign, in televised focus groups and man-on-the-street interviews, voter after voter expressed the utmost confidence that Trump could, quote, fix the economy because, quote, he knew how to run a business. Indeed, his electoral appeal was in large measure attributed to his perceived abilities as a successful entrepreneur. Never mind that he basically ran a family firm that was probably a few steps beyond a mom-and-pop grocery store, and his claims to entrepreneurial success are essentially Barnum-esque showmanship, from Barnum to Bannon. Without a doubt, he had mastered the ability to play the role of a successful executive on The Apprentice. As Vanity Fair editor Fran Lebowitz put it, I love this quote, he is a poor person's idea of a rich person. In sum, Trump's economic policies simultaneously eschew liberalism while advancing ideas that seem very much in keeping with neoliberalism. While he is clearly illiberal, and not just in terms of trade policy, we might think of his economic policy as a form of ill neoliberalism, a sort of diseased version in which the state increases its intervention in the market while simultaneously being subjected to market reason. And I'm reminded of that image, the flag from the American Revolution with the snake eating its tail. Is that part of it? Or maybe it's just a snake, anyway. But for me, it's a snake eating its tail.
I think it's just a snake.
Maybe. Okay.
But
Got that
it
wrong.
says, don't tread on me.
Yeah, but I think now the snake is eating its tail. In this ill neoliberalism, the market appears as what Derrida identified as a pharmacon, simultaneously a cure and a poison, the snake eating its tail. A poison to the white American working class, but a remedy to the hypostasized administrative state. It is here that secularism, or more precisely, the refusal of secularism, becomes a point of illumination. In a 2014 address delivered to an audience at the Vatican, Bannon laid out an apocalyptic vision of the clash of civilizations, in which he asserted that what he saw as the crisis of capitalism was attributed to the rejection of, in his words, the underlying spiritual and moral foundations of Christianity, and really Judeo-Christian belief. Bannon sees this Judeo-Christian capitalism as an antidote to the two dominant configurations of capitalism in the world today. The first is what he calls the state-sponsored crony capitalism of China and Russia that created massive concentrations of wealth. The second was the libertarian capitalism of what he calls the Davos class and Ayn Rand. Unironically invoking Marx, Bannon objected to this version on the grounds that it made people into commodities and objectified people. Those were his words. The common thread of these two forms of capitalism was that they were, in his view, atheistic and evacuated of both morality and spirituality. Bannon is vague about what this Judeo-Christian form of capitalism would look like, but it is clear that it would be nationalist in orientation, embrace competition and meritocracy, and seek to atrophy government. What to make of this convoluted and haphazard Trumponomics? As a number of scholars have pointed out, part of the success of neoliberalism has been its promiscuity, its ability to synthesize with a wide range of political and social formations. Awa An has shown how, in Southeast Asia, the state has sought to elicit a risk-taking, entrepreneurial population through the provision of basic human needs. Thus, 80% of the Singaporean population lives in public housing, healthcare is provided to all, and citizens enjoy generous state support for education, all the better to make a class of innovative entrepreneurs. In a different register, Andrea Muehlbach has shown how the dismantling of social welfare in Italy has accompanied not only a resurgence in Catholic ethical norms, but also a reliance on services provided by the church. In my own work on Islamic-inspired business leadership and self-help programs in Indonesia, and on Islamic finance in Malaysia, I've shown how neoliberalism can be readily assembled with Islamic practice and discourse. So perhaps the rise of Trumpism represents a new strain of the neoliberal virus, in which economic rationalization is being married to a resurgent nationalism. An ill neoliberalism indeed. Thank you.
Thanks. guess we'll open up to questions from, I guess if you could ask yourselves questions if you have any questions first.
Ask your own damn question.
Yeah. Elena.
Okay, wow, thank you for your 3 talks. I'm curious about how our panel's going to work, but I thought that the 3 talks really kind of
different.
they're in good dialogue with each other, I find. So just as a general observation, Daramir, I have a question about. I want to thank you for at least leading me in a direction where I've been kind of trying to figure out where does the anti-globalization movement fit in all of this. Like when you see the Brexiteers and Trumpism and so on, it's a decided this anti-neoliberal kind of rhetoric which you're describing. So I remember myself in the 1990s kind of going anti-globalization, and that was a movement of the left. And so this Trumpism and the variations in different regions, have they co-opted the anti-globalization movement? Where does anti-globalization fit?
I think that's an excellent question. And I think it shows how we might have got something wrong. At least about globalization and what it was. And I actually don't have an answer to that, but I think you're really onto something. I think, the presumption after 1989 and the fall of communism was that now we have this liberal order, neoliberal order. The market is unfolding. You get Fukuyama, the end of history, and in many respects, the anti-globalization movement was specifically a reaction to that, a kind of an effort to put the brakes on that acceleration. And now you see that there's this weird convergence between that, as you, I think, really astutely point out, between that and the nationalism of Brexit or Trump. And I think that's precisely the question that I'm wrestling with is, what did we get wrong about our diagnosis of globalization? And, what would a left politics look like that, rather than being anti-globalization, tried to take an alternative position on it? I don't know what that is. I haven't figured that out, but I think you put your finger on precisely what the question is.
I mean, it's a huge thing. Sorry if I can just follow up. I mean, if you look at Europe, the only option, so Merkel and all those people who welcomed refugees and so on.
Yeah.
The only response to the nationalists, the exiteers, is a globalization response, right? And it's
right.
How do we find ourselves in this constellation?
Right. The one thing that I think is instructive on this is a book by the anthropologist Douglas Holmes. It came out in 1989 called Integral Europe. I don't know if you've seen that. And you talk about these Parisian analysis and Foucault in '79 writing about neoliberalism, but I think Holmes really put his finger on something there, in which he basically said that the forces of integration were not inimical to the forces of fascism, and so that there's the EU and maybe fascism is too strong, but authoritarian nationalism and the resurgence of national identity, that those two things are much more recursive with one another. This is his argument. Much more recursive with one another and much more cycle back on one another than we like to think. And we think of the EU as being this moment of the dissolving or resolution of national difference. But what he shows in that book is that it's actually, at the same moment that you get European integration, it's intimately tied to the forces of disintegration and nationalism. And I think that's where we are. You know, that there's at some level integration, you know, it's the snake eating its tail. The integration created disintegration, and that those two, I mean, not to be Hegelian about this or anything, but, you know, that these two things kind of somehow are much closer to one another than we like to think.
Can I just, I just wanted to add that I just showed, for other reasons, the beginning of Triumph of the Will to my European Studies course, and I had forgotten that Hitler started out in the Socialist Workers' Party before he killed all the socialists in the Night of the Long Knives. But so you kind of see that already happening way back then, you know.
Yeah.
It's like, who was it? Somebody quoted, is it Mark Twain, that history may not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. It's like we're sort of in that moment where we see that sort of that guise of protection of a working class flipping over into a certain nationalist force that you don't really foresee as a socialist force.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think in the earlier lectures in Society Must Be Defended, and actually even before that, I think Arendt makes this point that society itself, the very concept of society, has these very strongly racist overtones, and that there's a certain racism in the very notion of society. And so there's actually people doing some interesting work now on NGOs and philanthropic organizations who basically reject society as the realm of intervention, and that they don't think in terms of society anymore because, well, they don't find it useful. They don't make this racial critique. But I'm thinking of the work of a guy at McGill called Tobias Rees, and he makes this argument that, you know, perhaps the way forward here is to stop thinking of our politics in terms of society or the social, and to start thinking of it in you know, a kind of globalization that a kind of globalism that isn't dependent on that on the one hand isn't dependent on the resolution of national difference or so distinctive societies, but on the other hand doesn't create these massive inequalities of wealth.
Can I ask about muscular nationalism? Pronounce your name again for me.
Shikata.
Shikata. Just along the same lines, maybe does that have to do with that?
So muscular nationalism is a concept that I sort of invented as I did my work on nationalism, and basically I define muscular nationalism as the intersection of imagined community with a particular idea of masculinity. And it's a masculinity that is a hegemonic masculinity that derives itself from Anglo-American ideas of martial prowess, strength, and so on and so forth. And so when you have this idea of masculinity and nation intersecting itself, the way that it's gendered is I say that there's a gender dichotomy called martial man and chaste woman. So martial man becomes sort of the protector of the motherland, and sometimes the fatherland, but it's really interesting because a nation becomes both represented by this muscularity, but it's also feminized because the martial man is protecting the nation as chaste women, right? So there's this really interesting dynamic going on where it becomes, which is the book that Emile mentioned, Muscular Nationalism in India and Ireland, where it becomes interesting is if muscular nationalism is set on this idea of a dichotomy, then what happens when women want to enter the martial role? And I look at a historical set of historical case studies from 1914 through 2004 in terms of India and Ireland, where various groups of women tried to take on these martial aspects and enter muscular nationalism, and you find really interesting negotiations that they had to do, and always it had to do with signifying chastity. So.
It's just interesting because it seems to connect with Trump's
Yeah,
sort of.
yeah.
Oh yeah, Trump is
Absolutely.
definitely a muscular nationalist.
Absolutely.
Whether or not he's actually not.
Well, and the racial dimension and exclusionary dimension of it as well. Yeah. No,
Arthur? A couple of questions. Yeah, that was great. So what would happen in the case of Quebec, where you'd have the language of, the liberal recuperation of the language of difference under the terms of reasonable accommodation and culture difference, and is really pushed aggressively by Quebec feminist nationalists who believe that they're recuperating Muslim women from dress restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So Quebec's, I forget what was it called, where they did the same kind of restrictions that France enacted. I forgot what the
Reasonable accommodation.
wasn't there a particular policy? It was called where Quebec came out with the same thing, that you couldn't have visible symbols.
Charter of values?
Yeah, it was something like that.
And no religious symbolism
And no
except for the cross.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that, again, that kind of an argument, they're following what Susan Okin is arguing, right? Susan Okin is arguing that there is no reasonable accommodation. There is, multiculturalism, because it protects these kinds of oppressive practices in the private that are oppressive for women. So one response, as I pointed out, has been Islamic women in diaspora saying, we are choosing to do this. This is how we express our religiosity, and so on and so forth. And I still think, as I've mentioned, that that's still a limited argument. I think we need to open it up even more. And this is why it makes me really sad that people aren't reading the works of Fatima Marnissi, the Moroccan feminist scholarship, because she does a really interesting way of removing the dialogue, that the veil, the headscarf, and so on, in Islamic women from this discourse of chastity and purity and religiosity, to show how complicated it is in terms of women's intellectual ambitions, way that women study, and so on. So the argument, and one of the most popular versions of her book that I teach in my Women, Race, and Empire, of her argument, is called Scheherazade Goes West. And it's and she uses the sort of example of Scheherazade, and says, Scheherazade when she comes to the West, becomes this sexualized, veiled, harem-like odalisque, as they used to call it. Whereas if you actually read Scheherazade in the original, in the Arabic, she's actually a very intellectual and very intelligent woman, and her sort of way that she protects herself is not by using her sexuality, but by using her mind and the way, and her intellect. So she creates this really interesting, very complicated discussion of veil, harems, and so on and so forth, using Scheherazade as and so I think she would say to these Quebec feminists that are arguing that, is that you have no idea of the complexities of how the veil, the harem, and so on, and you have absolutely no idea of the history of feminism in Egypt, Iraq, Morocco, and Algeria. And I think that if both feminists in the West and so on had the idea of the long sort of unfolding of nationalism and feminism and so on in these contexts, they would have a much more complicated, nuanced analysis than the veil is bad for you, or the veil is oppressive, which is problematic not only in all sorts of ways that I mentioned, but just the arrogance. Yeah. Just say, this is what you're doing is yes. So I hope.
Yeah, that's a great response. And can I have another question? Do you think you're selling Trump too short? You're sort of dismissive of Trump. I thought that was a bit of a mistake. I really liked your analysis, because I thought, well, come on, he's reanimating the American war spirit. That's, the Americans have been comfortable for a long time under the long sleep of Obama's reason, his appeal to the fact that the angels are better angels of our nature and just reason itself. The really dynamic element of America, which made an empire, is just this raging war spirit that wants to be released. It struck me with the 59 cruise missiles over Syria. It's the first markers of this. He's reawakened the war spirit in a very masculinist language of white nationalism. He's speaking to lower middle class people, working class people, presenting another eschatological story of American destiny. And he's doing it in a language which is illiberal to the point of hyper-fascist, I would say. And he skillfully uses the newest technologies of communication. He's the Twitter president, and completely has weaponized and brought into delirium any notions of truth-saying in social media and in media itself. It struck me as significant political advances, by the way.
Yeah, I didn't mean to sound as if I was selling him short at all. So I didn't mean to convey that. I think this is very serious. And that's why I actually take it seriously as an intellectual project to actually figure out what this is. Because I don't think this as I say, I mean, I don't think this line that, well, Trump, this represents the end of neoliberalism. I think that misses the boat completely and has the potential to kind of go off in a direction that is really misdiagnoses the situation. So I think as an analytical effort intended toward figuring out what a politics might be, that's what I'm trying to do here. So I didn't mean to convey I mean, if there was a theatrical dimension to it, it was purely for to hold people's attention. So you didn't fall asleep.
Something caught my attention and is a really discerning analysis in your book. So if I can just, so what is this? So it just strikes me, I thought the thrust of your analysis was really to figure out, well, what's happening to globalization,
Yeah,
and to this newest version of neoliberalism.
yeah,
And it strikes me that from your analysis, I thought, well, perhaps what's emerging is a form of like completed globalization. You know, we've gone through the first stage in which there's an easy balance between free trade agreements,
yeah,
transnational fluid flows of capital,
right,
nation states still enacting to protect themselves politically as best they can.
right,
This blows away nation states.
right,
Moves much more towards a predatory capitalism,
uh-huh,
and it's transnational in terms of, and ironically, it's deeply tribal. And the three big tribes
Right.
of the race, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans.
Right.
And the Europeans.
right.
You know, the ruling tribes are forming,
Right.
and they're going to form new transnational agreements.
To come back to the racism of society. Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's something there. You know, so if it's globalization 2.0, what is that? I mean, it seems to me it looks really different from globalization 1.0, although I suppose one could argue that that it was, you know, that it was always there. But again, it just, you know, and part of it is, you know, you can't figure this out because the guy will turn on a dime in 24 hours. So, you know, one day it's like, well, we can't really deal with Syria, and, you know, these are their problems, we're going to leave it alone. And the next day it's 59 cruise missiles, and it's like, you know, there was some piece I read today that it was like, that's the whiplash. So what is that? You know, is that the mastery of the communicative medium? Is that, you know, is it looks haphazard, but is there a calculation there? You suggest there is. I think you're right. I mean, I think there is
It might be
calculation.
the political triumph of Derrida's useless signifier.
Yeah.
When the signifier can just switch form and
Yeah.
turn into random slides.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and on that point, and some of you may have heard me talk about this before, but, you know, there was this incredible interview during the Bush administration, and I can't remember now who the journalist was. It was in the New York Times. And basically, he kind of was interviewing someone who was later revealed to be Karl Rove. And what the person who was later revealed to be Karl Rove was saying was, you know, the guy came up to me and says, well, what about these chemical weapons? What about Enlightenment truths? What about, you know, there is some reality out there that we can all agree on? And Rove basically said, look, there's no truth. You know, there's no reality. There's no objective reality out there. We're an empire now, and we make our own reality. And, you know, you can come along with your judicious Enlightenment values and try to study what that is, but we'll have moved on by then and we'll be making other realities. So I think there is. I mean, I think that point on the sort of empty signifier is absolutely astute. Yeah.
I wanted to jump in on the globalization thing. His use of phraseology is perhaps very, maybe not the most advanced, but Benjamin Barber's book, Jihad versus McWorld, I think anticipated a lot of this confusion that we're having. On one hand, you can have globalization, but on the other hand, you can have intense nationalism going on simultaneously. So, and also when the European Union first formed and people said, we're moving into a post-national world. And I'm like, yeah, right. This is not something that's going to happen. So I think we can have globalization and of predatory capitalism and global labor simultaneously with this, what Benjamin Barber unfortunately calls jihad, but what he means is intensive nationalist spirit. Secondly, sort of to go back to the conversation with the idea that you said about Hitler starting up with the Socialist Workers' Party, and sort of running back to what Dara is saying about society being racist, it depends on how you define who the worker is, right? We have this notion based on a sort of neutral objectivity of Marx that the worker is genderless, raceless, is this Rawlsian abstract individual. Yeah. Well, the worker is never a Rawlsian abstract individual. The worker in various kinds of movements is very much gendered and race, which is why in the labor movement, women had to fight to be seen as a worker, whereas in racialized people had to be seen as a part of the Marxist labor movement. So I think we should always be aware that these kinds of movements happen in seemingly contradictory ways, but once you unpack the sort of assumptions of gender, race, class, and so on that sort of imbue this, they don't seem that contradictory.
Yeah, can I just add a little bit to this broader conversation about globalization and empire? I think that it's good to bring into the table that globalization is not something that anybody can really agree about. And it's also not something that holds forth an easy periodization or an easy set of talking points. If we introduce something like free trade or so-called enlightenment values, those have always been implemented in a context of inequity. And I think one of the issues today is that, it's symbolized maybe by Trump in the United States, is that the sense that China and India, for example, are actual substantive competitors in a manner that they could not have been in an earlier era, so-called of globalization, is another element that is, of course, a live element that is often left out of any periodization of globalization. So every version of the modern global has included a version of imperial inequity, such that free trade was only for certain groups and certain individuals. And I think today, when that is increasingly difficult, more and more difficult to handle for those in power, it makes sense that the United States and that Trump speaks to the audiences that he does. It's not coming out of the sky. It's I think the fact that free trade now cannot be imagined in the way that it had been in the era of empire by the West. And so there has to be something different that emerges. And I think that's the world in which we live, and that's the world in which any nod toward universalism has to be thought of and then complicated in terms of not only where it comes from, but whether or not we have access to a universalism in present. I'm not sure if we do, but I think that as I ended my comments, I think that's one issue that we may consider thinking about.
And also just to build on what Nilesh was saying in terms of India, one of the things that my recent research is focusing on, as India becomes considered or starts considering itself a global competitor on the international scene, there is a rise in muscular nationalism, because there's also a rise in what I call the transnational middle classes or the global middle classes, who is the driving power of this globalization and benefit from it. So as they become more and more acknowledging that they are indeed a global power to be reckoned with, whether it's true or not, their sort of muscular nationalism in the Trumpian way is now you are having more discussions. This is why Hindu nationalists are in power there, because Hindu nationalists are completely, they don't make any sort of hypocritical thing that this is anything but Hindu dominance. What they do, they say is Hinduism is more liberal and secular, which is a really interesting equation they do. But they're very clear. And they have also resurrected discussions about empire. They said, you know, it used to be that before the British came, we had an empire in Southeast Asia, you know, and it used to, so they're also resurrecting their imperial sort of credentials to sort of add to this.
But I think I'd also just add to that as well, that even though I do believe that everything you've identified is very important to confront, in India, as in the United States, it's not as if this is from a mandate of a vast majority of people. This is actually from a very small population of India, but it is able to command this global audience, and is able to speak to these very issues because, of course, they have
Because of their
kind of,
economic,
yes.
yeah.
We have time for one more question. I saw Jonah's hand up.
I'll ask another one.
Sure.
I'm just wondering if this maybe speaks to the kind of ambiguity on the level of the nation. I'm going to inject a little bit of hope here. That on the one hand, maybe what you're calling nationalism is more like what Arthur was calling tribalism. That on the other hand, there is a sense in which a certain rule of law on a certain level could, not to say that it has, but it could protect real liberal tolerance and values. I mean, I think Canada's trying to do that. But, you know, it doesn't always succeed, but, you know, so you have this weird ambiguity, or do you think that, you know, what comes next? We just trash it. I don't know. How do we get out of the muscular version of nationalism and back to the sense that maybe there's a way in which an entity that is not allied with any particular, if we can do that, with any particular tribe or religion or color or could protect certain practices. Or is that just a pipe dream and I'd like, you know, grow up, have another cup of coffee?
It's a contradiction because in political science, nation and state are not seen as the same. Okay? Nation is the community, the imagined community.
Right? So what I'm talking about would be the state.
Yes, but where the contradiction lies in is that since the Treaty of Westphalia was signed, there is this notion that one nation, one state has one nation. Where the problem, so state refers to the sort of the governmental apparatus. So the notion was there is something called the Canadian Imagined Community, which is ruled by the Canadian state, right? The problem is, however, there is no the Canadian nation, right? There are many competing nations. What we have is a hegemonic and dominant nation that controls the state. So as long as you have these competing nations in this relationship with the state, right, you will always have this hegemonic nationalism, which in Canada is built on settler colonialism, you know, bright British, Protestant, and so on and so forth. You will have the state making certain concessions, absolutely, but will these concessions go as far? And what is the contradiction? And this is why I think that I sort of ended on not a very hopeful note, because as long as we have this, you know, we have this idea that there is one nation under God, indivisible, that's not true. Most of the world's nations, most of the world's states, there are multiple nations. And even in Europe, there were homogenous nations. This is being disturbed by the refugees coming in, who have their own idea of the nation, right? And so I think this is always, which is not to say that the state hasn't made certain liberal regulations, you know, minority rights, protection of, et cetera, but as long as we have this, you know, this contradiction and tension, which is why people are so disappointed with Justin Trudeau. You know, he came in. Well, Justin Trudeau has a particular nationalist community in mind. It's sort of a white, male, Judeo-Christian idea of Canada. You know, it's a maybe not as rigid as, say, Stephen Harper, but it's still there. So.
I think that's a great question, Nina. And I think I agree with you. I mean, as someone liberalism, with all its faults, many of which we've pointed out, I'm not sure what else there is.
Like Churchill now?
Well, no.
The last line of the Pledge of Allegiance is liberty and justice for all.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be nice if we
So-
take the rest of it out.
So again, I think, you know, the alternatives to liberalism scare me more than liberalism, I guess.
Is that good?
I know exactly.
Okay, no, go ahead, yeah.
I want to thank you for your last comment earlier, asking that question, because as someone who comes from Iran, I experienced Islamic Republic of Iran. I lived in California, Berkeley area for the last 30 years. What always bothered me in academic conferences like this is attack to liberalism without offering any alternatives, or at least admitting what you just admit. Because in my personal experience, lack of liberalism is horrible. And not hearing anything as an alternative from people who are educated, critical thinkers like yourselves, or this panel that I really enjoyed, was really scary. And to be honest with you, when Trump gained power, I thought maybe now intellectuals in America can also start taking this seriously, that if we criticize liberalism for good reasons, right? I'm all for it. Modernism, liberalism, we need to criticize it. But we need to also think about alternatives.
Yeah.
Because, as you said, the other side, I experienced it in Islamic Republic, was horrible. The basic human rights, the basic individual rights, protecting minorities' rights, women's rights, all so crucial that it's very important. Thanks for.
I just want to end by saying critique doesn't mean rejection. Critique means that you are invested in something being good. So.
But you know, not always, unfortunately, it's not clear. For example, when I hear Talal Assad, for example, criticizing secularism, is critique secular, or all those books that are very fascinating, but at the same time, I'm lost. Are they criticizing or rejecting secularism? Because that's what we need in Iran right now, you know? But it's not always clear, but thanks for your comment.
Well, on that note, thanks for So, take a short coffee break.
I'm gonna run that here in a moment.
Maybe reconvene at about